Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. The moment I stepped onto the property, I felt it. A strange pressure in the air, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had been warned about the place, but I didn't listen. After all, it was just an abandoned house, on the outskirts of town, nothing more than a rumor to most. But to me, it was an opportunity. The house had stood empty for decades, its windows cracked and boarded up, its once proud structure now sagging and decaying. I'd always wondered what lay inside. So, when a friend of mine found the key and dared me to go in, I couldn't resist. I pushed open the creaking gate and made my way up the overgrown path to the front door. It was an old Victorian-style home, with intricate carvings in the woodwork, now covered in layers of dust and neglect. I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me as I took my first step onto the porch. The door was unlocked, just as promised. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew heavy in my lungs. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating faded wallpaper, old furniture covered in white sheets, and a grand staircase leading up to the second floor. I started exploring, every step echoing through the hollow house. The rooms were filled with old relics, forgotten memories of lives once lived here, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned down a narrow hallway where the floorboards creaked under my feet. At the end of the hall was a door that wasn't like the others. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see a faint light. I hadn't seen any light fixtures, so I was puzzled. Curiosity pulled me forward. As I approached, I heard a soft, rhythmic sound, a slow thumping, almost like footsteps. I stopped, holding my breath. It wasn't possible. No one else was supposed to be here. I pushed the door open, heart pounding in my chest. The room was dimly lit by a single candle, flickering on an old wooden table. But that wasn't what made me freeze in place. At the table sat a figure, hunched over, its back to me. A dark silhouette against the candlelight. The figure was rocking, back and forth, the sound I had heard. It wore a long coat, its features hidden in the shadows. It didn't seem to notice me standing there. "Hello?" My voice came out shakier than I intended. The figure stopped rocking. A long pause, and then it slowly turned its head toward me. Its face was pale, its eyes sunken, as though it hadn't seen daylight in years. The corners of its mouth twitched into a grin. But there was something wrong about it. The eyes, they were hollow. I stepped back, my breath quickening. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure said nothing. It only tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. The air grew colder, the pressure in the room intensifying. My flashlight flickered, casting brief shadows across the walls. The figure reached toward the candle, its hand slow and deliberate, before snuffing it out. Darkness. Complete, suffocating darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to light my way, but as the beam of light cut through the room, the figure was gone. No sign of it, no noise. It was as if it had never been there. My heart raced. I was terrified, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I needed answers. Why had it been there? What had I just seen? I turned to leave, but then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible. "Leave now." It was a voice, low and ragged, but it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from all around me, the very walls themselves seeming to vibrate with the words. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly the temperature dropped even further, the air thick with an oppressive chill. A sharp thump echoed from upstairs, then another and another, like footsteps moving toward me. I bolted for the door, the whispering now a constant buzz in my ears. I could hear the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor behind me. I didn't dare look back. I finally made it out onto the porch, gasping for breath. As I turned to face the house, I saw the windows, once dark, now glowing faintly from within. And standing in one of those windows, staring down at me, was the figure, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. I ran down the path, not stopping until I was back on the main road. The house was silent again, but I knew it wasn't over. I never went back to that place, but sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the soft thumping, the whispering, and the unmistakable feeling that someone or something is watching me from the dark. The invitation seemed innocent enough. A friend, Emily, suggesting we explore the old mall on the edge of town. It had been closed for years, condemned after a string of accidents that no one ever fully explained. Rumors floated about it being haunted, but I didn't believe in that kind of thing. I was more of a thrill seeker, the type who didn't mind venturing into a place that was off limits. We arrived just after sunset. The parking lot was empty, overrun with weeds, and the mall's massive glass doors stood ajar, as if waiting for us. The dimming daylight cast long shadows on the cracked pavement, but we were too excited to be scared. Emily led the way, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Inside, the air was stale, the faint smell of mildew and dust hanging in the air. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting eerie glows on the abandoned stores. Broken mannequins stood frozen in the windows, some missing limbs, others twisted in unnatural poses. The silence was so complete that every step we took echoed, making the place feel alive, watching us. We made our way deeper into the mall, our footsteps reverberating against the hollow walls. Emily had her camera out, snapping pictures of the decaying storefronts while I surveyed the eerie surroundings. It was like stepping into another world, frozen in time, yet something about it felt wrong, like we weren't meant to be there. We reached the food court, its empty tables covered in dust, with old decayed menus still attached to the walls. A low growl of wind echoed through the open corridors, causing the nearby trash to shift slightly. It felt colder in this part of the mall, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. My skin crawled, but I dismissed it as my imagination. That's when we heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the soft shuffle of feet on tile. My heart skipped a beat. Emily froze mid-step, her flashlight flickering as she scanned the area. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat tightening. Yeah. We both strained to listen, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence returned, thick and oppressive. I turned to Emily, who was now looking behind us, her face pale. "Let's go," she said, voice shaky. Before I could respond, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deeper in the mall. A door slamming shut. It sounded close. My blood ran cold and we both spun toward the sound, but no one was there. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, and the mall suddenly felt too large, too empty. I started walking toward the exit, but Emily grabbed my arm, her eyes wide in terror. "Look," she whispered, pointing. I followed her gaze, and my stomach dropped. At the far end of the food court stood a figure. A person, but something was off. The figure was dressed in an old, tattered uniform, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us. My pulse raced. Emily tugged on my sleeve, urging me to leave, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Then, the figure began to move, not toward us, but away from us. Its steps were slow, deliberate, like it was waiting for us to follow. The flickering lights overhead buzzed louder, and the shadows seemed to stretch around it, pulling it deeper into the dark corridor. Without thinking, I bolted. "Run!" I screamed, and Emily didn't hesitate. We sprinted toward the exit, but the mall seemed endless, like it was shifting, getting larger the more we ran. The walls seemed to close in on us, the distant sound of dragging footsteps echoing behind. I glanced back and the figure was there, right behind us, moving faster now, its footsteps a sharp, rhythmic slap against the cold tile. We reached the main doors, but they wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. Emily screamed, trying the handles over and over, but it was as if the building was holding us inside. I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was right there. I reached into my pocket, my hands shaking, and grabbed my keys. Desperately, I shoved them into the door's emergency exit. The door clicked open just in time. We scrambled out into the night air, gasping for breath, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The mall doors slammed shut behind us with a finality that echoed down the empty street. I looked back, but the lights inside had gone dark. The place was silent once again. We didn't speak much on the drive home. I could feel Emily's eyes on me, but neither of us said anything about what happened. Later, when I looked through the photos Emily had taken, I found one picture of the food court, just before we ran. In the corner of the frame, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure, smiling. I'd been exploring abandoned places for years, but something about the subway tunnels under the city felt different. The stories I'd heard were chilling. People who'd wandered in never came back, or if they did, they were never the same. The city had shut down the old subway years ago, but I'd managed to find a way in. I descended into the darkness alone, the flashlight beam dancing along the walls, revealing peeling paint and rusted signs. The tunnels stretched endlessly, and there was an eerie silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums. My breath was the only sound, and even that seemed too loud. I walked deeper, the temperature dropping with each step. The air was thick, with dust, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered. I passed the empty platforms where old, faded advertisements clung to the walls. Most of the station names were barely readable, but one stood out: Ashford Station. There was no reason to go there, but something made me curious, so I veered off the main tunnel and headed toward it. When I reached the platform, I paused. The station was even more decayed than the rest, with broken glass and chunks of concrete scattered across the floor. My flashlight flickered. I muttered to myself, trying to calm the nerves creeping up my spine. I scanned the walls for any indication of what had happened here, but there was nothing but silence. That's when I heard it, a faint thud coming from the tracks. I froze, my heart hammering. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, but my curiosity held me in place. The thud came again, followed by what sounded like dragging footsteps, slow, methodical. They echoed down the tracks toward me. I couldn't tell if it was just my mind playing tricks, or if someone, was there. I aimed my flashlight down the tunnel, but the beam only pierced the darkness for a few feet before disappearing into blackness. Then I saw it, a shadow, tall and hunched, moving in my direction. It was slow, its movements jerky, like something was wrong with its limbs. I stepped back, my pulse spiking. The shadow grew larger, but there was no sound of feet shuffling against the ground, just a scraping noise like something dragging. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, but the sound of scraping feet followed me. Faster now, closer. I reached the main tunnel, breathless and terrified, but when I glanced over my shoulder there was nothing. The scraping had stopped. My heart was still pounding in my ears, but the tunnel behind me was empty. I didn't care anymore. I sprinted through, the dark, the tunnel stretching before me like an endless, oppressive maw. The sound of my own footsteps echoed off the walls, and I nearly tripped over an old rail track. I wasn't sure how long I ran, but it felt like forever. The fear gripped me tighter with every step. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the entrance. The faint light from the street above shone through the small crack in the subway door. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the door open, ignoring the scream of rusted hinges, and stumbled out into the fresh air. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath, heart still racing. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the shadow, the scraping footsteps, and the feeling of something chasing me, even though I couldn't see it. But as I walked home, I glanced over at the old subway entrance one last time, and for a split second, I thought I saw something standing there in the dark, watching. I haven't been back to the subway since. The thought of what's down there, waiting, in the dark, keeps me up at night, and I know now that some things are better left undisturbed. I was on a red-eye flight, exhausted but unable to sleep. The plane hummed softly, the dim cabin lights casting long shadows over rows of dozing passengers. Outside the window, the sky was an endless black void. No stars, no moon, just nothingness, stretching forever. Somewhere over the ocean, things changed. I glanced up and noticed the flight attendants standing eerily still in the aisle. Their faces were blank, eyes unfocused, bodies rigid. I thought maybe I was just overtired, but then I saw the other passengers. The ones who had been asleep a moment ago were now sitting upright, staring straight ahead, not moving, not blinking. A cold chill ran down my spine. The man next to me, who had been snoring for hours, was suddenly silent. Too silent. His chest wasn't rising or falling. I nudged him slightly. His head turned toward me. Too quickly, too smoothly. His eyes were wide open, but they weren't. Right. They were empty. A slow, unnatural grin spread across his face. Shot up from my seat, heart pounding, and turned toward the flight attendants. One of them, a woman with perfect blonde hair and a crisp uniform, suddenly locked eyes with me. Her head tilted slightly, too sharp, too unnatural. "You should sit down," she said. Her voice didn't match her lips. It echoed, as if coming from somewhere else. I stumbled back. The entire cabin was wrong. The hum of the plane sounded distorted, almost reversed. The other passengers remained perfectly still, their eyes locked forward. Then, all at once, they turned to face me. Every single one. I ran toward the back of the plane, desperate to find a real person, someone normal. But as I passed each row, I realized their faces were changing. The passengers' features were melting, twisting into something inhuman. Their mouths stretched too wide, their eyes black and bottomless. A baby that had been crying earlier was now silent, its head turning impossibly far as I passed. I reached the back of the plane, my breath coming in short gasps. The door to the rear galley was slightly open. I pushed through, slamming it behind me. The small space was empty except for a single window. I pressed my forehead against it, trying to calm myself, but what I saw outside made my stomach drop. The plane wasn't moving. We weren't flying. We were just suspended in darkness. No clouds, no stars, no ground below, just an endless black void. Then I heard it, a slow, rhythmic tapping against the window. I turned, dreading what I would see. There was a face outside. It wasn't human. It had no eyes, only deep, empty sockets. Its mouth was too wide, grinning, stretching across its entire face. The thing pressed its long fingers against the glass, tilting its head as if studying me. I stumbled back. The door behind me burst open, and I was yanked back into the cabin. The passengers were no longer seated. They were standing, their heads all tilted at the same unnatural angle, their mouths opening in unison. The blonde flight attendant stepped forward. She smiled. "You should sit down," she repeated. Then everything went black. When I woke up, the plane had landed. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow through the windows. The passengers were gathering their things, chatting, stretching. Everything looked normal. Had I dreamed it? I reached for my bag, my hands still shaking. As I stood to leave, I glanced at my seatmate, the man who had been beside me the whole flight. He smiled, his mouth stretched just a little too wide. The storm hit unexpectedly. One moment the sky was clear, and the next a blanket of clouds rolled in from the sea, turning the ocean into a frothing beast. I was halfway through my trip when I saw the lighthouse on the cliff, a silhouette against the darkening horizon. The waves crashed against the rocks below, and I could barely see through the rain, but I decided to stop for shelter. The lighthouse wasn't in operation anymore, just an old structure with a rusty iron door that creaked on its hinges, but it looked sturdy enough and I needed to wait out the storm. I knocked on the door, unsure if anyone would even be around, but it opened almost immediately. An old man stood there, thin and gaunt, his skin pale as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. His clothes were weathered, and his eyes, wide, unblinking, held a kind of wildness that unsettled me. "Storm's bad," he rasped, stepping aside to let me in without a word more. Best not to stay outside. I hesitated, but something about his voice, thick with urgency, made me step inside. The place smelled of salt, mildew, and something metallic, like rusted metal. The walls were lined with old lanterns, each one still glowing dimly in the corner. The man led me into a small sitting room where a fire crackled faintly in the hearth. "You're the first visitor I've had in years," he said, his eyes flicking to the windows, as if something beyond the glass might be watching. "Stay the night if you like. The storm's too fierce to be out there." I nodded, grateful for the shelter, though uneasy under his watchful gaze. As the storm raged outside, the man spoke little, occasionally muttering about the sea and the things that had come from it. His words didn't make much sense, but I didn't press him. After a while, I made my way to the window. The rain beat against the glass and the waves crashed violently onto the rocks below. That's when I saw it. A figure standing on the rocks just outside the reach of the waves. A person. It wasn't the old man, and it didn't seem like anyone I knew. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure was barely visible, a shadow in the storm. "Who's out there?" I asked, my voice shaky. The old man was standing behind me before I could turn around, his face too close to mine. "No, one should be out there," he whispered, his breath cold against my neck. "Not in that place." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. "Are you sure? It's a person?" I asked, my voice wavering. The man didn't answer at first. His gaze was locked on the window, but his body was rigid, his hands trembling. He finally spoke, his voice lower now like a whisper in the dark. "I've lived here for years, you know, and there's something you should know about this place." His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. "Once the storm starts, the keeper comes," he continued, his eyes flicking to the window again. "But the keeper is not a man. He's something else." I turned back to the window. The figure was closer now, standing still as the waves crashed around it, unmoving. My heart skipped a beat. "You're not making sense," I said, my voice trembling. "Who is it?" He took a deep breath. "The keeper used to be a man. Long ago, before I took this job. He kept watch over the lighthouse, watching the sea for ships, for dangers. But he didn't leave when the others did. They say the sea claimed him, but he never truly left. He stays out there, waiting." Suddenly, the figure moved, its body jerking unnaturally, as if being pulled by invisible strings. It walked toward the lighthouse, its movements stiff and inhuman. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The old man grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Get away from the window. It sees you. It knows you're here." But it was too late. The figure had reached the base of the lighthouse. The storm had stopped, and the silence was unbearable. Then a knock, sharp, deliberate, on the door. I froze. The old man didn't move, his eyes wide with fear. He whispered, "He's come for you." I turned, my heart racing. The door shook. Under the force of the knock, louder now. almost as if it were being pounded. I didn't know what to do. I didn't understand. The keeper wasn't just some legend, some haunting tale. He was real, and he was here. Without another thought, I ran to the door and flung it open, only to find nothing but the dark, empty night. There was no figure, no storm, just the cold, eerie silence of the lighthouse. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no storm. There was no sea. There was only the keeper, and he had never left. I'd always been drawn to abandoned places, and when my friend Jacob invited me to a secluded cabin in the swamp for the weekend, I thought it would be the perfect escape. We arrived just after dusk, the sun sinking low behind the dense trees that bordered the swamp. The cabin stood at the edge of the water, a dilapidated structure with peeling paint and broken windows. Jacob seemed unfazed by the isolation. "It's not much, but it'll be peaceful," he said, a grin on his face. We unpacked quickly and lit a fire in the small fireplace inside. The crackling warmth didn't quite chase away the chill that lingered in the air. We spent the evening laughing, drinking, and telling stories. But as night fell, I began to feel a strange unease. The swamp outside was still, unnaturally so. There were no crickets, no frogs, not even the sound of wind through the trees. Just silence, the kind that presses against your ears, making you hyper-aware of every little sound. It was around midnight when it started, a low, rhythmic thumping from outside the cabin. I tried to ignore it at first, assuming it was the wind or some animal wandering by, but as the thumping grew louder, I began to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Jacob," I whispered, my voice tight. "Do you hear that?" He paused, listening intently. "It's probably just an old tree settling," he said, though I could tell even he was starting to feel uneasy. But then the thumping came again, closer this time. It wasn't coming from the trees, though. It was coming from the water. I went to the window, heart pounding. The moonlight reflected off the surface of the swamp, casting eerie shadows across the dark waters. For a moment, I thought I saw something, moving just beneath the surface, something large, shifting. My breath caught in my throat, but when I blinked, it was gone. "Let's check it out," Jacob said, standing up, clearly not as spooked as I was. I hesitated, but curiosity won out. We grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The thumping was now unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, like something heavy was being dragged through the water. We made our way to the dock at the edge of the swamp. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and for a moment, everything was still. And then I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and hunched over, emerged from the water. It wasn't human. Its skin was mottled and gray, wet from the swamp, dripping with murky water. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light of the flashlight in a way that made my stomach churn. It was dragging something behind it, something large and heavy, just out of sight. Jacob stepped forward, but I pulled him back. "We need to go now," I said, my voice trembling. But before we could turn to run, the creature made a low, guttural sound, almost like a hiss, and the air grew colder. The thing raised its head, and in a slow, deliberate motion, it dropped whatever it was dragging into the water with a splash. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed Jacob's arm, pulling him back toward the cabin. The creature didn't follow, but I could feel its eyes on us as we ran, an unseen weight pressing against our backs. We slammed the door shut behind us and locked it. We stood there for a moment, panting, staring at each other. Jacob was pale, his face tight with fear. What was that?" he stammered. I didn't have an answer. The thumping sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse, thick, suffocating. We tried to sleep, but every little sound seemed amplified in the dark. The floorboards creaked with every step. The wind outside rattled the windows. I kept seeing flashes of movement through the cracks in the walls, the shadows in the corners of the room shifting when they shouldn't have. I finally gave up on sleep, pulling out my phone to check the time. It was 3:42 a.m. I went to the window, hoping to get some fresh air, but as I looked out, my heart stopped. In the swamp, near the edge of the water, there was something else, another figure. It was standing there, still as stone, watching the cabin, the same glowing eyes. I stepped back, my breath coming in short gasps. "Jacob," I whispered, turning to him. He was standing by the door, eyes wide. He opened his mouth to speak, but then the door behind us creaked. Slowly, it began to open. I turned around, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive silence and that cold air that was creeping in from the hallway. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, like a door slamming open, but there was no door. No wind. Just the sound, loud enough to shake the walls. I looked back at the window. The figure was gone, but the thumping. It had started again. This time, it was moving closer, closer than before. We never spoke about what happened at the cabin. We left at first light and never returned. The storm hit unexpectedly. I had been on the small fishing boat for hours, and the sky had seemed clear, but within minutes, dark clouds swallowed the sun, and the winds picked up. I had to find shelter, and the only refuge in sight was the old lighthouse perched on the rocky cliffs. It wasn't on any of the maps. It wasn't even used anymore as far as I knew, but in the thickening fog, it was my only option. I steered the boat toward the shore, the waves crashing harder against the hull, and when I reached the dock, I ran, soaked to the bone, toward the tall structure looming above me. The door creaked open when I tried it, and I stepped inside. It was cold and smelled like mildew and salt, a scent that clung to the walls. The light from my flashlight barely cut through the dark interior, revealing old equipment long abandoned. The air felt still, as if the place hadn't been touched in years. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I didn't expect the man sitting in the corner. He was hunched over, a thick coat wrapped around his shoulders. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his eyes, deep and hollow. He wasn't moving, just staring straight ahead. "Hello," I called out, but he didn't respond. I took a step closer, but before I could say anything else, his voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come," I stopped. His words were low, almost a whisper, but they chilled me to the bone. "Storm's bad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I needed shelter, just until the weather clears." The man didn't move, but he slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of them, cold, empty. "You can't leave once it starts," he said. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "The storm will pass, and I'll be gone in the morning." The man stood, up suddenly, his movements jerky as if they were forced. "No one leaves, not once the storm starts. You'll see." I felt a wave of unease flood over me. Something wasn't right. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier. I didn't know why, but I couldn't leave. Something held me there, a force I couldn't explain. "Who are you?" I asked. His lips twitched into a twisted smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm the keeper. Always have been." Before I could respond, the sound of thunder rumbled above, shaking the lighthouse. The storm had intensified, the wind howling against the windows. The fog outside had thickened, and I couldn't see anything beyond the glass. I stepped back, my mind racing. I needed to leave, but the door was now shut tight, the handle unmoving when I tried to turn it. Panic surged in my chest. The keeper's voice broke through my thoughts again. "They'll be here soon, and they'll take you, like they took me." I didn't understand what he meant, but the way he said it, the finality in his tone, made my stomach turn. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above like something heavy had fallen. I spun toward the spiral staircase leading to the top of the lighthouse. My heart pounded in my chest and my legs moved before I could think. I rushed up the stairs, the wind howling louder the higher I went. As I reached the top, I was hit by a blast of cold air. The lantern room was empty. The storm raged outside, but what caught my eye wasn't the storm. It was the figure standing in the corner. It wasn't the man I'd seen downstairs. This figure was taller, darker, its form indistinct, like it was made of shadows. And it was staring at me. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind screaming, but my body frozen. The shadow moved closer, the temperature dropping so rapidly I could see my breath. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice like ice scraping against metal. I tried to back away, but my legs buckled and I fell to the floor. The shadows. Cold hands wrapped around my throat and the air grew thick, suffocating. The last thing I remember was the keeper's voice, distant but clear. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." When I woke up, the storm was gone. The sky was clear and the lighthouse was silent. But I wasn't alone. The keeper stood at the top of the stairs, his hollow eyes meeting mine once more. "Welcome to the lighthouse," he whispered, and the door opened on its own. And I knew, without a doubt, that I'd never leave. I wasn't supposed to be there. I had stumbled into the old abandoned subway system by accident. My friends and I had been exploring the city's hidden corners, sneaking into forgotten places beneath the streets. This one, though, felt different. The air was heavier, thick with something unsettling. We had wandered into an old maintenance tunnel, its walls covered in layers of grime and peeling paint. The further we ventured, the more the silence pressed against us, like it was waiting. For something. My friends joked, laughed off the eerie feeling, but I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't supposed to be here. At the end of the tunnel, we found a rusted iron door. It didn't seem like it had been opened in years. A dim light flickered. Inside, the crack beneath the door. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The room was large, filled with old subway carts that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like eerie curtains. But what caught my attention wasn't the abandoned carts or the darkness. It was the tracks that led further into the shadows, far beyond where the city's light could reach. Without thinking, I stepped onto the tracks. My friends hesitated, but curiosity won out. The deeper we went, the quieter the world seemed. It wasn't just the usual silence of the underground. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. And then, footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding, in my chest. The others noticed, too. We all stood still trying to listen, but the sound was impossible to pinpoint. It wasn't one set of footsteps. It was multiple. "Hello?" My voice was shaky, breaking the eerie silence, but no answer came. Just the steady echo of footsteps that seemed to circle us. I spun around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Only the endless tunnel stretching behind us, swallowing the light from our flashlights. Then the footsteps stopped. Suddenly, the overhead lights above us blinked and hummed to life. Dim at first, then brighter, illuminating the tunnel ahead. I wished they hadn't. As the light flickered, I saw them. Figures. Not human, but shaped, like people. Their outlines were distorted, flickering like shadows cast by a broken bulb. They were standing at the end of the tracks, barely visible, but their hollow eyes locked on us. I couldn't move. The figures started walking toward us slowly, their forms warping as they came closer. The footsteps weren't just sounds anymore. They were coming from the figures themselves, too, but their movements were unnatural, jerky, like they were walking in a dream. "Run," I whispered. Without another word, we turned and bolted back the way we came, but the tunnel stretched longer and longer the further we ran. The figures were getting closer, their movements impossibly fast now, even though they hadn't been moving at all when we first saw them. We reached the door, but it wouldn't open. The rusted iron had jammed. I slammed my shoulder into it again and again, the cold metal giving way with a horrible screech, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the footsteps were growing louder. The figures were almost upon us. Then, just as I thought we were done, the door finally gave way. I shoved it open, tumbling into the hallway with my friends right behind me. The door slammed shut with a violent crash. We gasped for air, staring at the sealed door, our hearts still racing. But as I looked around, I realized something. The hallway was different. The walls were lined with the same rusted subway cards. The overhead lights flickered with the same unnatural hum. The figures, they were gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped. It wasn't until I glanced back at the door that I saw it. A handprint, smeared in wet, black oil, was pressed against the glass window in the door. It wasn't just a handprint. It was new. We weren't the only ones who had passed through. Something had followed us out, and I wasn't sure it was done with us yet. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. My friends and I rented an old house out in the countryside, far from the distractions of work and city life. The house was charming at first glance. Tall, weathered with ivy creeping up the walls, a large front porch, and surrounded by a dense forest. We thought it was the perfect place to relax and disconnect. But the moment we stepped inside, something felt off. The air inside was heavy, stale. The house creaked as if it were alive, settling into itself. I chalked it up to the age of the place, but as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept in, I couldn't shake the unease. We were sitting in the living room, laughing and catching up when we noticed something strange. At first, it was subtle, a faint scratching noise like something dragging across the walls. It was quiet at first, so we tried to ignore it. But then it grew louder. Eli, who was sitting closest to the wall, stood up abruptly. "What the hell was that?" he asked. We all froze, listening. The sound was unmistakable now. Soft, almost rhythmic scraping coming from inside the walls. "Maybe it's just rats," Sarah suggested, though her voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied. "That doesn't sound like rats." The noise stopped suddenly, plunging the house into silence. We all exchanged uneasy glances. I shook my head, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the night wore on, we tried to put it out of our minds. We played some music, had drinks, and talked. But every so often we would hear a faint scraping, just enough to keep us on edge. At around midnight, we decided to call it a night and head to bed. I took the guest room upstairs, a small, sparsely furnished space with an old wooden bed and a dusty, peeling wallpaper. As I lay there, trying to sleep, I heard it again. Scratching. But this time, it was right behind the headboard. My heart raced as I sat up, looking at the wall. The sound came in short bursts, like nails being dragged across wood. My breath caught in my throat, and I pulled the blanket over my head, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But then there was a knock, soft but deliberate, right at the headboard. I froze. My mind raced. Who would be knocking on the wall? I waited, breath held, straining to listen. Another knock, and then another, closer now, as if someone, or something, was tapping from inside the wall. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I threw on my shoes and ran downstairs to find the others. They were in the living room, looking as panicked as I felt. Sarah was holding her phone, her face pale. I found something," she stammered, showing us a picture on her phone. It was a faded photograph of the house, taken from the outside. In the picture, you could barely make out a figure standing in one of the upstairs windows. It was tall, unnaturally still. There was no mistaking it. It was watching us. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house. We all jumped, and the walls seemed to groan in protest. The scraping started again, louder this time, followed by another knock, right under our feet, coming from the floorboards. Panic surged through us. Eli grabbed a flashlight and bolted toward the basement door. "We need to get to the crawl space," he said, his voice tight. We ran, down the stairs, through the darkened hall, and into the basement, where Eli pried open a wooden trap door that led to the small crawl space beneath the house. The air down there was thick with dust. We could barely see anything in the flashlights. Beam. We huddled together in the narrow space, hearts pounding. The scratching sound was now coming from the walls around us. And then, we heard it. A voice. Low and raspy, it whispered, "You can't hide." I whipped around, my pulse racing. The voice was coming from inside the walls, but the walls were solid. We should have been able to hear nothing. But there it was, unmistakable, a voice seeping through the cracks. I barely had time to react. The walls started to shake, the wooden beams creaking and groaning like they were under pressure. The air became stifling, the sound of the scraping building into a deafening roar. "Get out! Get out now!" Sarah screamed, pushing past me toward the trap door. We scrambled up and out of the crawl space, rushing toward the front door. But as I turned to look back, something caught my eye. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly, staring at us from the walls. I screamed, but no sound came out. The eyes blinked, and in that moment, I knew we weren't alone. We didn't stop running until we reached the nearest road, far from the house. As we looked back, the house stood silent once more, the lights flickering faintly in the distance. We didn't know what had been inside those walls, what had been watching us, but we never went back, and I've never been able to forget those eyes, watching us from behind the walls, waiting. I've always liked quiet places. A small, remote town tucked away from the rest of the world seemed like the perfect getaway for me, especially after the chaos of my city life. So, when I found a listing for an old house to rent near a church, with a bell tower, I didn't think twice. The house was cheap, charming, and isolated. The perfect retreat. The first few days were peaceful. The church, with its ancient stone walls and weathered wooden doors, stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, visible from my window. It had always struck me as eerie, but in a beautiful way. The bell tower rose high above the trees, and every evening at dusk, the bell would ring. It was a deep, resonant sound, and it seemed to shake the ground. At first, I didn't mind it. In fact, it felt like part of the charm. But by the fourth day, I started noticing something strange. The bell rang at random times, not just at dusk. Sometimes it would toll in the middle of the night, echoing through the valley, waking me from a deep sleep. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a broken mechanism or the wind, but it felt wrong, unnatural. One evening, I decided to go see it for myself. I walked through the overgrown grass, the setting sun casting long shadows on the path. The door to the church creaked open as I pushed it. The smell of mildew hit me and the air inside felt damp. I hesitated at the entrance, looking up at the tower that loomed above me like a dark sentinel. The church was empty, but I could hear something, faint like a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the tower. It was coming from inside the church, from somewhere deep in the building. I moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, my footsteps echoing through the hollow space. The floorboards creaked beneath me. The whispering grew louder as I approached the altar where an old wooden door was slightly ajar. The voice was clear now, too clear. "Leave." I froze. The voice was not a gentle plea, but an urgent command. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I turned back toward the door, but before I could leave, the bell began to toll again. This time, louder, more violent. The sound seemed to shake the walls, rattling my bones. I stumbled backward in panic, but the door to the church slammed, shut behind me. I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The whispering grew into a cacophony of voices, all calling to me, chanting words I couldn't understand. The bell tolls had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural noise that reverberated through my chest. I looked up and saw something that made my blood run cold. The bell tower was no longer still. It was moving, shifting, like a dark figure was taking shape inside it. I could make out the faintest outline of a man, no, a thing, standing in the tower. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, I will never forget those eyes. They were glowing with an unnatural light burning through the darkness. A voice, not a whisper this time, boomed in the church. "You shouldn't have come," I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. The figure in the tower moved, its limbs stretching unnaturally, and I realized with horror that it was descending, coming down toward me. I ran. The door to the church suddenly flew open, but I didn't stop to question it. I bolted down the path, my heart racing as the bell tolled once more, deafening, shaking the earth beneath my feet. I didn't look back. When I reached my house, I slammed the door shut and locked every window, but I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just outside. I could hear the toll of the bell, even now, in my mind, constant, unrelenting. That night, I woke up to the sound of the bell tolling again. It was midnight, but it was not the usual toll. This time the bell rang 3 times in rapid succession, followed by a silence that was more terrifying than the noise. I heard a knock at the door. My heart stopped. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. The door creaked open. I could see the silhouette of a figure, standing in the doorway. It wasn't a man, but something else. I couldn't see its face, only the faint glow of those glowing eyes, and then I heard the whisper again, only this time, it wasn't in the church. It was right next to me. Leave. But it was too late. The figure stepped forward, and the last thing I saw was the glowing eyes before everything went black. I should have never gotten on that train. It was late, the platform empty except for me and a few tired commuters. The overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I checked my watch, just past midnight. The last train of the night. I'd been traveling for hours, exhausted, and wanted nothing more than to sleep through the ride. When the train pulled in, it was old, creaky, with rust on the edges of the doors and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. The conductor, an older man with a weathered face, stood at the door, motioning for us to board. I was the only one who stepped on. The train was nearly empty except for a single passenger sitting in the far corner. He was hunched over, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, his coat a dark, tattered thing. I slid into a seat near the front, trying to avoid eye contact. As the train lurched forward, I settled in, pulling my jacket tighter against the cold draft that seemed to seep from the walls. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks was soothing at first, but soon it began to feel off. Too loud, like it was rattling deeper than it should, scraping the metal in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, pulling out my phone to check the time. That's when I noticed something strange. There was no signal. I glanced up. The lights flickered again, and the overhead speaker crackled to life, making an eerie sound. But instead of the usual announcements, a low voice whispered through the static, "Don't look at the man in the corner." I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I slowly turned my head toward the far corner of the car. The figure was still there, motionless, but somehow it felt like he was closer. My heart raced as I turned back to the window, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The voice came again, clearer this time, but still muffled, as if coming from a long distance. "His eyes are waiting. He's already seen you." A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I gripped the armrest, my fingers trembling. The train rattled again, harder this time, and the lights flickered once more, casting long shadows across the floor. I couldn't help myself. I turned to look again. This time, the man in the corner was staring directly at me. His face, pale and gaunt, was partially obscured by the brim of his hat. but his eyes, black, hollow pits, seemed to bore into mine. He smiled, just a slight curling of his lips, and I felt the air around me grow even colder. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is this the last stop?" The man didn't move, but the conductor appeared at the front of the car. His face was pale, his eyes wide with an expression that wasn't fear, but something else, something far worse. He glanced nervously at the man in the corner and then back at me. "You need to get off the train," the conductor said, his voice shaking. "Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, but when I reached the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. That's when the man in the corner stood up. His movement was slow, deliberate. He took one step toward me, and the train's lights flickered once more, casting everything in an unnatural, sickly glow. "Get off." The conductor's voice was desperate now. "The train never stops. It never goes anywhere." I turned, scrambling toward the exit at the far end, but the man was in front of me now, too fast, his long, pale fingers wrapping around my wrist. His grip was cold, unyielding. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered, his breath a rotten stench in my face. I fought against him, my pulse hammering in my ears, but it was like trying to fight against a stone wall. He dragged me toward the rear of the train, and the walls seemed to close in, the metal groaning under pressure. The conductor had vanished. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop. The world outside the window was pitch black. No lights, no stars, just an empty void. The man let go of my wrist, stepping back. "You're one of us now," he said, his smile wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. Then everything went quiet. I was still in the train. The seats were empty. The lights flickered again, but I could hear nothing but my own breath. The train didn't move. It didn't even seem to be on tracks anymore. It just sat in an endless black void, waiting, and I realized, too late, that the last stop had already passed. The train had been on its way to nowhere for years, and now it had me. I moved into my new apartment a few weeks ago, the one in the old brick building at the edge of town. The rent was cheap, and I wasn't picky. The place had its quirks, creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, but it was mine. I liked the solitude. It was the middle of the night when it first happened. I had just gotten into bed, my lights off, and the apartment silent, when I heard the knock. One knock, clear and deliberate. I froze. It came from the door. I thought it was a mistake, maybe a neighbor, but when I checked the peephole, no one was there. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just imagining things. I locked the door again and went back to bed, the silence thick in the air. A few nights later, the knock came again, just one. At first, I thought it was some prank, but as I stood in front of the door this time, I noticed something strange. The hallway light was flickering. It wasn't a power surge, more like something else, something unnatural, like it was struggling to stay on. My pulse quickened. I leaned in closer to the door and put my ear against it. The silence was almost suffocating until I heard a soft whisper. "You're not alone." My blood ran cold. There was no one out there. I backed away from the door, shaking. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next knock. I didn't hear anything for a while, but then, there it was. The knock came again, louder this time. I jumped. The apartment felt colder, the shadows seemed longer. But this time, I did something different. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly unlocked the door, heart hammering in my chest. When I opened it, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, the light still flickering. There was no one there. I checked the other apartments, but no one was around. I closed the door, my mind racing. What was going on? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The knocks kept coming, always at night, always the same. One knock, and then that voice. "You're not alone." Finally, after days of sleepless nights, I decided to confront whatever it was. I waited, the knife in my hand, as the clock ticked toward midnight. As soon as the knock sounded, I rushed to the door, but this time, something was different. The door was moving on its own. It creaked open a fraction, and I could see a shadow through the gap. I didn't want to open it further, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached out and I pushed the door open completely. The hallway was darker now, darker than it had ever been. I could barely see anything, but then I saw it. There, standing at the end of the hall, a figure, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadows. It was wearing something that looked like an old, tattered coat, its arms long and unnaturally thin. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of it standing still, waiting. For the first time, I felt pure terror. The thing didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence. I could feel it in my bones. I slammed the door shut. The knock came again. But this time, I didn't answer. Instead, I ran. I grabbed my things, my keys, and bolted out of the apartment, down the stairs, through the lobby. I didn't stop running until I was outside. I called the landlord the next morning, explained everything. He listened quietly, then told me something that made my stomach twist. "You're not the first to report this," he said. "The building, it has a history." "History?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The knock, the visitor. It's been here for years. Every tenant hears it. It's always the same. One knock, and then it shows up." I wanted to scream, but all I could do was hang up. I never went back. To this day, I never hear a knock when I'm at home. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear a whisper. "You're not alone." I had always been fascinated by abandoned places. So, when a friend mentioned an old hospital on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist. They said it was off limits, but that only made it more enticing. It was late in the evening when we arrived, the building towering over us like a forgotten monument. The windows were cracked, and the metal gates creaked as if warning us to turn back. But we didn't. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked, already setting up his flashlight. I grinned. "What's the worst that could happen?" We snuck inside through a broken window. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold and decay hit me instantly. The halls stretched out before us, endless and dark. A few flickering lights above cast long, eerie shadows on the cracked tiles. It felt like the walls were breathing, alive with the history of the place. We explored for what felt like hours, taking photos, joking nervously and daring each other to venture deeper into the heart of the building. But when we reached the old surgical ward, the mood shifted. I wasn't sure what I expected, but the silence here felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. The room was empty, save for the rusted, abandoned equipment. As I shined my flashlight around, my beam landed on something strange. A door at the far end of the room barely cracked open. "Did we check that one?" I asked, walking toward it without waiting for a response. Jake was right behind me, but his steps were quieter now, more hesitant. "I don't know. It doesn't feel right." I ignored him. The door creaked open on its own, and the room beyond was pitch black. For a second, I stood frozen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Then, a sharp noise echoed from within, the sound of something scraping against the floor. Jake's breath hitched behind me. "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly. Something was definitely in there, but I couldn't turn back. The adrenaline was too strong. I pushed the door open further, and the beam of my flashlight revealed the interior, an old elevator. Its door, half open, revealing a dark shaft beyond. Before I could react, Jake grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." But it was too late. The elevator's doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. The lights above flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving us in absolute darkness. I could hear Jake's panicked breathing beside me. The air in the elevator felt colder, and a strange pressure built, like something was moving in the shadows around us. Suddenly, a voice whispered through the dark. It was faint at first, a soft, raspy breath against the back of my neck. "Help. Me?" I froze. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or something more sinister, but the whisper came again, louder this time, desperate. "Help. Me. Please." I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. There was nothing but darkness. "We have to get out of here," Jake hissed, pulling at the elevator's emergency button. But it didn't work. The floor beneath us trembled, and the elevator began to descend. Slowly, unnervingly so. Each floor passed with an agonizing slowness, and with each passing moment, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding us, pressing in on all sides. "Help me! Help me!" Suddenly, the elevator stopped. Not at a floor, but at a point between floors, suspended in midair. And the whispers? They stopped too. There was silence. I didn't want to move, but I had no choice. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure Jake could hear it. We reached for the door, pushing it open slowly, only to find ourselves staring into a pitch-black void. The walls around us were smooth, no floor, no ground. Just a dark pit that seemed to stretch on forever. That's when I saw it. A figure, thin and pale, its eyes wide and empty, staring directly at us from the abyss. Its lips parted, but no sound came from it, only a cold, unsettling air. Its face was twisted in agony. It was waiting. Before I could react, the elevator shook. Violently, the walls seemed to close in, pressing against us. I could feel the cold, damp air around me, thick with something foul and ancient. And then, as quickly as it all started, the elevator began its ascent again. We shot up through the building, the sound of the elevator's old mechanisms grinding. And just as abruptly as we'd entered, we were back at the top. The doors opened into the hospital's empty lobby. I turned to Jake, who was breathing heavily beside me. His eyes were wide, filled with fear. "We need to get out of here, right now." I didn't need to be told twice. We ran for the exit, not stopping until we reached my car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the dark, looming structure in my rearview mirror, only to see that one of the windows at the top floor was wide open, and behind it, the same pale, empty face pressed against the glass, watching me leave. It was supposed to be a quick ride home. I had missed the last bus, and the only option left was the late-night train, which was notoriously empty at this hour. As the train doors closed behind me, I realized there was no one else in the car. I shrugged it off, no big deal, just a quiet ride. The lights flickered once, then settled into a soft hum. The train started moving, its wheels clicking against the tracks, almost too rhythmically. As I glanced out the window, the city was swallowed by the dark. I was now passing through the outskirts, where the trees pressed in against the track. Few stops passed, and the train was still eerily empty. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through mindless social media posts, but my mind kept wandering. There was something unsettling about the stillness, the silence. A shiver ran down my spine. Then the door at the far end of the car slid open. A man stepped in, tall, with dark hair and an old-fashioned trench coat that swayed as he moved. He didn't look at me, just made his way to the seat directly across from me, sitting with his back to the window. His presence felt odd, out of place. I noticed his shoes, too, polished black leather, the kind that felt like they hadn't been worn in years. I didn't say anything, just stared at him. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. The silence stretched longer than I was comfortable with, and the train rumbled louder as we hurtled through the darkness. After a few minutes, I saw something strange. A reflection in the glass. The man's reflection didn't match his movements. His head was tilted slightly forward, but his reflection stared straight ahead. I blinked and looked away, chalking it up to the weird lighting in the train. But the feeling of unease stuck. The train screeched as it slowed for the next stop, but something was wrong. The doors didn't open. Instead, they remained sealed shut. I pressed the button to call the conductor, but nothing happened. The man turned his head slowly toward me, his eyes glimmering like he had been waiting for this exact moment. "You shouldn't have gotten on," he whispered, his voice sending a chill down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers tightened around my phone, but I couldn't look away. "The train never stops," he said again, his lips barely moving. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, this time much longer than before. When they came back on, the man was gone. No door had opened, no sound of him leaving. He had simply vanished. My heart raced and I grabbed the nearest handle, trying to open the door myself. Nothing. The walls felt oppressive, closing in on me. Panic crept into my chest. I pounded on the emergency button by the door, but still, nothing. The train roared through the darkness, faster now, shaking violently as though it had been jolted into overdrive. I stumbled back into my seat, clutching the armrests. My mind raced with thoughts of what the man had said. The train never stops. Suddenly, I heard a sound. Soft, faint, like someone was whispering. The voice wasn't from the direction of the door, it was right behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. The whispering continued, growing louder. "Get off the train. It's too late." My blood ran cold. I tried the door again, but it was locked. I could see the next stop approaching through the window, but the train didn't slow. The station passed by in a blur, and the train only gained speed. I heard a faint click like a key turning in a lock. Then the man reappeared, this time standing beside me, his face inches from mine, his cold breath on my neck. "You can't leave. You'll be with us now," he murmured. I screamed and tried to shove him away, but my hands passed right through him. He wasn't real. The train wasn't real. The reflection in the window changed. Instead of the dark landscape outside, I saw another car, filled with people. They were all staring at me, their eyes hollow, their faces expressionless. They didn't move, and I realized with a sickening jolt, they were all dead. I was surrounded by ghosts. The man smiled, his face splitting wide. "You're the last one," he said softly. "The train always finds someone new." I fought to breathe, to scream, but no sound came out. The train wasn't slowing. The dark figures in the reflection were coming closer, pressing against the glass. I could feel their cold hands on my skin, tugging me toward them. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the train jerked to a stop. The lights went out, and everything fell silent. When I opened my eyes, I was standing on the platform of an empty station. The train was gone. The night was still, and the air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. I ran, not stopping until I reached the nearest street. My phone had no signal, no record of the train, and the time was frozen at 11:59. The worst part? The next night, I saw a missing persons poster with my own face on it, dated the night before. It started like any other night. I was home alone, sitting in my apartment in the city. It was just past midnight and I was scrolling through my phone trying to kill time before heading to bed. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound in the quiet apartment. Then the phone rang. I glanced at the screen. No name, just a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something compelled me to answer. Maybe it was the silence pressing in around me, or maybe just curiosity. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a strange sound, like a crackling static, followed by the faintest whisper. "Hello?" I repeated, louder this time. The voice was barely audible, but I heard it clearly enough. "I can see you." My heart skipped a beat. It was so soft, so casual, it sent a chill down my spine. I quickly pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen, convinced it was some kind of prank. But the number was still there. No name, just the same. Strange digits I didn't recognize. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to stay calm. The voice didn't respond. The static came back, louder this time, and the whisper followed. "I can see you. You're not alone." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I was sure someone was playing a sick joke. But why would they say that? I was alone. Completely alone. I looked around the dark apartment, my eyes scanning every corner. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Suddenly, there was a loud thud coming from the hallway outside my door. I froze, staring at the door as my heartbeat quickened. My mind raced. There was no one in the building at this hour, just me. The phone line crackled again. "I'm getting closer." I swallowed hard. Fear began to crawl up my spine. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't think straight. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking, and slowly stood up. I tiptoed toward the door, heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was silent. I cracked the door open just a sliver, enough to peer out. The lights were dim in the hallway, casting long shadows. There was no one. But then I saw it, on the floor. Just outside my door, a single red rose lying perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. The rose looked freshly picked, the petals bright and red against the dull gray carpet. My mind raced as I backed away from the door, my hands now trembling uncontrollably. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked it up quickly. "You shouldn't have looked," the voice said, its tone now dark, heavy with malice. I slammed the phone down, panic rising in my chest. Something wasn't right. There had been no one in the hallway moments ago. No one to leave that rose. A soft, almost imperceptible knock echoed through the door. I stepped back, my heart hammering. My body was frozen, every muscle screaming for me to move, but I couldn't. The knock came again, louder this time. Then the voice, barely a whisper but undeniably close. "I'm here." I stumbled backward, my legs barely holding me up. The walls seemed to close in. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The phone buzzed in my hand as it vibrated uncontrollably. My eyes darted to the window. The blinds were closed, but through the cracks, I saw a figure standing just outside, tall, shadowy, unmoving. The breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but somehow I knew it was watching me. I turned away from the window, trembling, and backed toward the door, heart pounding in my ears. The knock came again, this time with force. The door handle began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. I ran. I bolted into the bathroom and locked the door, my pulse racing in my neck. I pressed my back against the cold tiles, breathing heavily, trying to control the panic. There was no way out, no escape. The phone buzzed again. The display flickered. I slowly reached for it, my hands shaking. I hesitated for a moment before answering. The voice on the other end was different now. Not the same eerie whisper, but clear, cold. "I'm inside," it said. I glanced around the small bathroom, eyes darting to the darkened corners. There was nowhere to hide. The door opened. The lights flickered. The figure stood in the doorway, face obscured by shadow. "I told you I could see you," the voice echoed. I dropped the phone as the lights went out completely, plunging me into pitch darkness. The air was thick and suffocating as I scrambled to move, to run, but something held me in place, paralyzed with terror. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The figure, the voice, the phone calls, they all stopped. Never found out who had been calling or how they had gotten in. When I left the apartment the next morning, everything was exactly as it had been before, still untouched. But every night since then, I've heard that same voice again, whispering, "From the shadows, I can see you." It was supposed to be a simple night, a quiet evening spent helping my friend Tom move into his new place. He had recently bought an old house at a ridiculously low price, a fixer-upper with charm, as he put it, but I should have known better than to trust my instincts on a deal that cheap. The house was located on the outskirts of town, far from the busy streets. A faded "For Sale" sign still hung by the rusted gate when I arrived. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark, with ivy creeping up the stone walls. Tom greeted me at the door, smiling as though he hadn't noticed how unsettling it looked. "Thanks for helping," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "You'll love this place once we get it cleaned up." I smiled, but I wasn't convinced. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. Tom led me inside and we started unloading boxes. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the air smelled faintly of mildew, dust, and something else I couldn't place. After a while, Tom disappeared upstairs to deal with some of the furniture, leaving me to explore. I walked around, finding the usual clutter of an old home, cracked mirrors, faded wallpaper, and warped floorboards, but when I passed through the kitchen, I saw something odd. A small door at the far corner, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It led to a dark stairwell that seemed to disappear into the earth. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer and pushed the door open. A blast of cold air rushed up from the stairs, sending chills down my spine. I could hear faint noises, like creaking wood, from below. Something wasn't right about that cellar. I called up to Tom, but he didn't answer. Shrugging it off, I began my descent. The staircase creaked under my feet, and the air grew colder with each step. The light from above barely reached the bottom. By the time I reached the cellar, I couldn't see anything. I pulled my phone out to use the flashlight, but the screen flickered before going black. I was plunged into darkness. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, like someone whispering my name. I froze. My heart raced. The whispers grew louder, but they didn't sound like Tom. The voice was low, almost guttural, coming from the farthest corner of the cellar. I backed away, trying to find my way back up the stairs, but the whispers grew more frantic, the air colder, and the shadows seemed to shift. I could feel something in the room with me, something watching. My breath quickened, and I knew I had to get out. Suddenly, the phone flickered back on, illuminating the space just enough for me to see a figure standing in the corner. I blinked. The figure wasn't Tom. It was a tall, thin man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide open, fixed on me with an unsettling stare. He was dressed in a tattered suit, his skin almost translucent. I turned to run, but as I did, the cellar door slammed shut. I was trapped. The man didn't move, but his eyes followed me as I pounded on the door, yelling for Tom. The whispers turned into a guttural chant, repeating my name over and over, growing louder and louder. The walls of the cellar seemed to close in. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a small wooden box on the floor. It was old, covered in dust, with strange symbols carved into the surface. Without thinking, I grabbed it and opened it. Inside was a small, yellowed note and a key, rusted and old, like it belonged to a different time. In a panic, I shoved the note into my pocket and grabbed the key, fumbling for the lock on the cellar door. As my hand touched the handle, I felt a sharp cold run through my fingers, like an ice-cold hand gripping mine. I jerked back, gasping, and looked up to see the figure had moved closer, his skeletal fingers reaching toward me. I quickly unlocked. The door flinging it open just as his hand brushed against my arm. I didn't look back. I ran up the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet, until I burst into the main floor and slammed the door behind me. I stood there, panting, eyes wide, with terror. Tom was standing in the hallway, looking confused. "Hey, what happened?" he asked. I glanced at the cellar door, now closed tightly as if nothing had happened. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I stopped. The note in my pocket had slipped out without me noticing. I reached down and pulled it out. The message was scrawled hastily in faded ink. "Don't leave the cellar unlocked." A chill ran down my spine. I turned back to Tom. He was smiling at me now, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Why didn't you come down?" "I was getting worried," he said, his voice oddly distant. I stared at him, my mouth dry, the words catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. I glanced over at the cellar door once more, and this time I could hear it. The whispering again. It was calling my name. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. I was house-sitting for an old friend, just a routine task. The house was in a quiet suburb, nothing unusual about it. My friend had asked me to stay for a few days while they were out of town, and the idea of having a large, empty house all to myself seemed like a peaceful escape from the usual noise of the city. The house wasn't particularly old, but it had a strange, faded charm. The walls were lined with family photos that had begun to yellow with age, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. It was well kept, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The silence was too heavy, too deliberate, as if the house was holding its breath. On the first night, I kept the lights on. The silence felt oppressive, and I couldn't bring myself to wander through the darkened hallways. But by the second night, curiosity got the better of me. The house felt strangely familiar, like I had been there before, though I knew I hadn't. As I roamed through the dimly lit rooms, I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. Every corner I turned seemed just a little too shadowy. That's when I noticed the whispers. They started faint, barely audible, like they were carried on the wind. I figured it was just the house settling, but as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls, but whenever I pressed my ear to them, they stopped. It was as if the house itself was trying to speak, only to fall silent when I paid attention. By the third night, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. They echoed through the house, now distinct words, soft, chilling, and indecipherable. I kept moving from room to room, but no matter how far I walked, they followed. It felt as though the house had come alive, consumed by some unseen force. Then, around midnight, the lights flickered and died. Panic shot through me as I realized the house was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but my signal was gone. I was cut off from the world. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I stood frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps weren't like any I'd ever heard. No one walks like that. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was making those sounds didn't have legs. The pacing grew louder, closer. Then a knock, just one, but it wasn't at the door, came from inside the walls. A hollow knock, repeated over and over as though someone was trapped behind them, trying to escape. My blood ran cold as I backed away, feeling trapped and surrounded by darkness. I didn't know how long I stood there, but soon the whispers became more than just disembodied sounds. They were calling to me. They seemed to come from all around, each word spoken clearer than before. "Let us out," they pleaded. "Please, help us." In a moment of sheer terror, I bolted for the front door. I didn't care about the force keeping me there. I had to escape. But as I unlocked the door and pushed it open, I realized it wasn't my front door. The house I was standing in wasn't the one I had entered. I had stepped into a house identical to the one I had come from. Same layout, same old photos on the walls. But something was different. The air was colder, the silence deeper, and the whispers had followed me, now louder and more desperate. I didn't dare go back inside. Instead, I ran into the night, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The whispers still echo in my mind. Each word burned into my memory. And even though I made it out, I know the house isn't done with me. Sometimes I hear those whispers in my sleep. They're never far. They're still calling. My cousin and I used to explore the fields behind our grandparents' old farmhouse every summer. The place was vast, with acres of corn and wheat, a rickety barn that seemed like it might collapse any day, and a patch of woods that everyone in the family avoided. Grandpa always said it wasn't safe. Snakes, sinkholes, or some vague story about trespassers, we never believed him. This summer, curiosity got the better of us. On a lazy afternoon, after Grandma fell asleep on the porch, we grabbed flashlights and decided to explore the woods. It wasn't a planned adventure, just a spur-of-the-moment thing. The air was cooler under the canopy of trees, the thick smell of moss and earth surrounding us. The deeper we went, the more the sounds of the farm disappeared. No wind rustling, the corn, no birds. It felt like stepping into another world. My cousin, always braver than me, joked about finding hidden treasure or an old cabin full of relics. We didn't find treasure. What we found was something else. About half a mile into the woods, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a strange structure. A stone well, covered with moss and half crumbling, like it had been there for centuries. But what was odd wasn't the well itself. It was the carvings on the stones around it. Strange symbols and spirals, etched deep into the surface, uneven like they'd been scratched in with trembling hands. My cousin leaned over the edge of the well, shining his flashlight down. I expected to see water or maybe just darkness. Instead, there was a dull shimmer, like something metallic reflecting light far below. He whispered something, but I wasn't paying attention. My eyes were fixed on one of the symbols on the well's rim, a crude, jagged spiral. It felt alive, almost pulsing under the flashlight beam. Then we heard it, a voice. It wasn't a shout or a whisper, but something low and guttural, echoing faintly from deep inside the well. My cousin stumbled back, dropping his flashlight into the pit. The light flickered as it tumbled down, illuminating the sides of the well as it fell. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow curling along the stone. I grabbed his arm, whispering that we needed to leave, but he just stood there, staring at the well, his mouth slightly open. When I shook him, he finally snapped out of it, muttering, "Did you hear it? It said my name." I didn't want to argue, I just wanted to get out of there. I pulled him away, and we hurried back through the woods, tripping over roots and branches. The air felt heavier now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. By the time we reached the edge of the trees, we were both gasping for breath. We didn't tell anyone about the well. Not that day, not that summer. But things changed after that. My cousin started sleepwalking, which he'd never done before. He'd wake up outside, standing at the edge of the cornfield, always facing the woods. One night, he woke me up, standing by my bed with a blank expression, saying he needed to go back. I tried to convince him it was just a dream, that the well wasn't real, or, if it was, that it didn't mean anything. But he was adamant. He said it was calling him, that it wasn't finished with us. The last straw came on the final night of the summer. We were packing up to leave the farm when I heard the screen door slam. My cousin was gone. I ran outside, shouting his name, but there was no answer. Grandma and Grandpa were asleep, so I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the woods. I found him in the clearing, standing next to the well. He wasn't moving, just staring down into the darkness. When I called his name, he didn't respond. I ran to him, grabbed his arm, and shined my flashlight into the well. What I saw still makes my skin crawl. The shimmer from before was gone. Instead, there was something climbing up the walls, something with too many limbs, its skin slick and glistening like oil. Its face wasn't a face at all, just a mass of sharp, twisting shapes. I screamed, pulling my cousin away. As we stumbled back, the well went silent again, and the clearing felt empty, lifeless. He finally looked at me, his face pale, and said, "It knows us now." We never spoke about it after that night. The woods were off limits for the rest of the summer, and the next year the farm was sold. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I see that thing climbing toward us, and I hear its voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably calling my name. It was just another late shift at the old office building. I worked as a security guard, tasked with patrolling the vast, dimly lit halls of a towering skyscraper in the middle of the city. The building had been empty for years, its windows dark and vacant. My shift started at midnight, and the solitude was always oppressive. I was used to the silence, but tonight felt different. The city was distant, barely visible beyond the thick glass of the high-rise. No cars passed, no lights flickered in the surrounding streets. It was as if the entire world had gone to sleep. I checked my phone. No signal. The usual hum of the city had faded completely. Around 1 a.m., something changed. I heard it first, a iki, faint whisper carried through the air like a sigh. I froze. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the ventilation system, but it wasn't coming from the usual source. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, echoing off the empty office walls as if they were coming from inside, the building itself. At first, I assumed it was just the building settling, but the voices didn't seem to belong to any natural source. They were disjointed, fractured, as if they were fragments of conversations I couldn't understand. I strained to make out the words, but they blurred together into an incomprehensible murmur. Around 2 a.m., the lights flickered. Just once. A sharp, sudden blink that cast everything into eerie shadows. It lasted only a second, but the sensation it left behind lingered. I knew I was alone in the building, yet the air seemed thick, like something or someone was watching me from the corners of the rooms. The whispers turned darker. They weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, distorted and echoing, rising from the shadows that lined the hallways. They called out to me, not with words but with sounds too inhuman to recognize. My heart pounded, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen as they swirled around me, more insistent, more real than they had been just moments before. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but something felt wrong. I checked the security cameras. The building appeared empty, but the static on the monitors wasn't just visual. It felt alive. A dark shape lingered at the edge of the screen, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I stared harder, but the image flickered and vanished. The whispers turned to laughter, cold, hollow laughter that seemed to come from all around me. I covered my ears, but it was inside my head now. The walls seemed to pulse, vibrating with the unnatural sound. My breath came shallow, and I realized I wasn't breathing properly. Suddenly, I heard a soft, deliberate knock on the office door. A single knock. I jerked around, my pulse racing. The building had no one but me. Yet I knew someone, or something, was on the other side. Another knock, louder this time. I stumbled toward the door, my mind screaming to get away, but my legs refused to move. The whispers grew deafening, echoing through my skull. "Run!" they hissed. Tears blurred my vision as I reached out for the door handle. My fingers trembled, and as I turned it, I felt a chill seep through my palm. The door swung open, and there was nothing but darkness beyond. I hesitated, heart pounding in my chest. A breath escaped me, ragged and trembling. The hallway was empty. No one was there. Yet, I knew they were watching from the void. I slammed the door shut and didn't stop running. I left the building and didn't look back, not until I was far from that cursed place. The whispers still haunt me, still echo in my mind, in quiet moments when I think I'm alone. I survived that night, but something followed me. Something isn't finished yet. It was a quiet, ordinary evening when we decided to explore the old tunnel beneath the city. The tunnel wasn't exactly hidden, but it wasn't well known either, just a place some kids had talked about exploring years ago. My friends and I, curious and bored, thought it might make for an interesting adventure. None of us expected what we would find. The entrance was hidden under a narrow bridge, overgrown with weeds, covered in graffiti. It smelled of damp earth and decay. As we walked down, flashlights cutting through the darkness, the air grew colder and the walls seemed to press in around us. The tunnel stretched ahead, endless, lit only by the faint glow of our headlights. First, everything felt normal. The tunnel echoed with the sound of our footsteps and the strange whispers of the wind. But the deeper we went, the more the feeling of unease settled over us. My friends joked, trying to lighten the mood, but I could tell we were all on edge. There was something oppressive about the tunnel, as if it had been waiting for us. Then we heard it. Faint, distant at first, like a whisper. "Help! Help!" We exchanged uneasy glances. The voice wasn't loud enough to make sense of, but it seemed to resonate through the tunnel like a ghostly echo. I knew then that we were no longer alone. One of my friends, Sam, called out hesitantly. "Hello? Is someone down there?" The response came again, louder this time. "Help! Help! Please!" This time it was clearer, as if someone was begging us from the darkness. We hesitated, unsure whether to respond or run, but something about the desperation in that voice kept us rooted in place. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. The silence that followed was worse than any response. We listened to the sound of our own breathing, the faint drip of water from the ceiling. Then, another sound, soft, dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. "Please. Help! I'm trapped," the voice called again, but this time it was closer. We didn't move. The flashlight beams swept the shadows searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing to be seen. The tunnel stretched endlessly, the darkness swallowing the light. Suddenly, something shifted. A figure emerged from the blackness. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The shape was twisted, elongated, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it moved toward us. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, empty and hollow, like voids in the darkness. "Help!" the figure rasped, its voice distorted, as though speaking from a place far beyond our world. We backed away, panic surging through us. The tunnel seemed to stretch further, the walls closing in around us. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't something we could fight. Without thinking, we turned and ran. The tunnel echoed with our footsteps, the strange cries of the figure fading behind us. I didn't stop until we burst out into the cold night air, gasping and trembling. None of us looked back. To this day, I don't know what we saw. The tunnel remains beneath the city, hidden, waiting. I've tried to convince myself it was a dream, a trick of the light, but I know better. Something is down there, something that shouldn't be disturbed. I still hear the voice sometimes, calling from the dark, and I know I'll never forget it. It was a clear autumn evening when we decided to take the old dirt road that led up to the old, overgrown orchard. My friends and I had heard stories about the orchard from people in town, though they never seemed to agree on what was true. Some said it was haunted. Others just dismissed it as an old tale. Either way, we figured there was no harm in checking it out. The orchard itself was vast, rows upon rows of crooked, gnarled trees that stretched far beyond where we could see. We wandered through the uneven rows, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet echoing in the stillness. The air was sharp and crisp, but it didn't take long before a chill ran down my spine. Something about the place felt off. We stopped near the center of the orchard where a large, ancient tree stood alone. Its trunk was thick and hollow, gnarled like it had seen centuries of storms and time. Its branches stretched out in every direction, but many had broken over the years, leaving it with a twisted, skeletal shape. Something about the tree felt familiar, though none of us could place why. We sat beneath its shade, passing around a flask of whiskey, laughing and joking. The evening felt peaceful, almost too calm. The further we moved from the edges of the orchard, the quieter the world became. It was as though the trees had swallowed all sound. As we sat there, something began to change. The laughter tapered off, and we all felt the weight of the silence settle in around us. I glanced around, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The sky had darkened, casting the orchard in a strange, otherworldly glow. The usual sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, the calls of distant birds, were gone. The forest beyond the trees was quiet. Then I noticed something out of place. In the distance, between the twisted trunks of the apple trees, there was a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, its form barely visible in the shadows. My stomach tightened. I couldn't make out what it was. It was too far away to see clearly, but its presence felt wrong. I whispered to my friends, pointing toward the figure. They followed my gaze but saw nothing. "It's just the trees playing tricks on you," one of them said, laughing nervously. "Nothing's there." But I knew what I had seen. I could feel its eyes on me, though there was no way to be sure it even had a face. The longer I stared, the more the figure seemed to blur, as if it was blending into the darkness itself. Then, as if in response to my fear, it began to move. Slowly, almost deliberately. "Let's head back," I said, my voice trembling. "Something's not right here." As we made our way toward the edge of the orchard, the atmosphere grew, heavier, suffocating. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted limbs reaching out as though they were watching. The figure was gone now, but I could still feel its presence, lingering like a shadow just beyond my vision. When we reached the dirt road, we didn't speak much. The eerie stillness of the orchard had left us all shaken, and none of us wanted to turn back and look at what might still be lurking behind us. It wasn't until we were safely back in town that we realized we had left something behind. My phone buzzed as we sat around a fire in someone's backyard. It was a message from one of my friends with only one word: "Look closer." Confused, I opened the photo he had sent. It was a blurry shot, taken just as we left the orchard. In the background, barely visible, there was the figure, standing between the trees, its features obscured but still there, watching. We've never gone back to that orchard, and I pray we never do. A friend suggested we drive out to the old factory, located deep in the woods. The place had been abandoned for decades, they said, left to rot after the industry moved elsewhere. No one had been there in years, and the idea of exploring an eerie, forgotten space seemed too intriguing to resist. We set off early in the afternoon, 3 of us packed into an old sedan. The drive was long, winding through narrow, overgrown roads until we finally reached the outskirts of the factory. From the outside, it looked like a relic of another time. Tall, weathered brick walls covered in ivy, windows shattered and empty. The once mighty structure loomed over us, silent and still. We parked the car, and as we approached, a shiver ran down my spine. The place felt abandoned, sure, but not empty. There was a palpable sense of something watching, something that had never truly left. Inside, the factory was a maze of metal and decay. Broken machinery stood rusted and still, large gears covered in dust. The air smelled stale, and the silence was oppressive. We wandered through the empty halls, shining our flashlights on walls covered in graffiti, peeling paint, and remnants of what once was. At first, there wasn't much to see, just shadows stretching across the floor, the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above. But as we moved deeper into the building, things began to feel wrong. It wasn't the faint echoes of our footsteps on the concrete floor, or the way the dust seemed to hang in the air like a living thing. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't fear in the usual sense. More like an overwhelming sense of presence, something watching, following us. We kept moving, dismissing the feeling as overactive imaginations, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. We reached what had once been the main hall, a vast expanse of cracked tiles and broken machinery. At the far end, partially hidden by a stack of debris, was a staircase leading to what looked like the second floor. We made our way towards it, stepping carefully through the clutter of fallen pipes and rusted metal. That's when we heard it. A low, faint groan, like metal twisting under pressure. We froze. It wasn't coming from the floor above, it was below. My stomach sank as I realized it was coming from the basement. The noise was distant, almost mechanical, but it felt wrong. I was about to suggest we leave when one of my friends, Jason, walked toward the staircase. His flashlight beam flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls as he climbed. The sound continued, growing louder now, as if whatever made it was approaching. "Come on," Jason called back, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Let's see what's down there." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. The others followed Jason down the creaking staircase, leaving me behind, my nerves frayed. I clutched my flashlight tighter, scanning the space. The noise had grown deafening now. Something was down there, something heavy. When I reached the bottom, the scene before me made my breath catch. The basement was larger than I'd expected, filled with old machinery and storage crates. But what stood out were the deep, claw-like scratches etched into the floor, running from one end to the other. It was like something had dragged itself across the concrete, leaving long, deep marks behind. I tried to tell myself it was just decay, but the noises had stopped. The silence was now deafening. We all stood there, staring at the marks, when one of my friends let out a gasp. I followed his gaze, and there, in the far corner of the basement, was something I'll never forget. A figure, a tall, pale figure with hollow eyes, barely discernible in the dim light. It was partially obscured by shadows, its features indistinct, but I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, locked onto us. "No," I whispered, taking a step back. "Let's go." But Jason was already moving toward it. His flashlight illuminated the figure, and for a moment we all stood frozen, unable to look away. Suddenly, the figure spoke, not with words, but with a low, inhuman hum that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. It wasn't a voice so much as a presence, pressing down on us, suffocating us. "We need to leave," one of my friends finally said, his voice trembling. We didn't wait for a second invitation. We fled up the staircase, the sound of the figure's hum fading behind us. My legs felt like jelly as we burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. As we drove away, I glanced back in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the darkness of the forest. But there, standing at the edge of the factory, was the figure. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us as we drove away. We never spoke about it again. But I know what I saw that night wasn't something from this world. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting. The night it happened, I was driving home from a late shift. I always took the same winding route through the countryside, cutting through deserted backroads that few ever traveled after dark. There's something unsettling about these roads. No streetlights, no signs of life, just miles of empty fields and trees on either side. It's the kind of place that always feels like it's hiding something. That night, the air was unusually cold, even for late October. The moon was almost full, casting a dim, eerie glow over everything. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant sounds of animals, just the low hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt. I wasn't in a hurry to get home, so I kept my speed steady, the familiar stretch of road ahead seemingly endless. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was someone waiting for a ride, but there was something off about it. How still it was. How unnatural. I slowed down as I approached. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It was just standing there, its back to me. I could barely make out its shape in the dim light, but I could see enough to tell it wasn't human. Its form was too tall, too thin, like it didn't belong in this world. My heart began to race as I drove past, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still there. But it wasn't. I told myself I had imagined it, that the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it again, this time, closer. The same figure was standing at the edge of a field, facing me directly. Its silhouette was more distinct now, and I could make out its long, slender arms hanging limp at its sides. I wanted to turn around, to speed back the way I came, but something kept me driving forward. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel tighter, my breathing shallow. The figure stayed motionless, not moving even as I passed. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the trees thinned out that I realized the figure had somehow crossed the road ahead of me. It was standing there, halfway between where I'd last seen it and my location. Panic surged through me. I had no idea what this thing was or how it kept appearing. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding past it without looking back. But every nerve in my body screamed for me to stop. When I finally reached the outskirts of the town, the figure was gone. I drove the rest of the way home, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The figure had felt wrong. Too wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I had seen, convinced that whatever it wasn't something human. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. And I knew. I knew it wasn't done with me. It started with a simple trip. Me and a few friends decided to rent a small lake house, nestled deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life. The house was old, wooden, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet hum of nature. We thought it would be perfect. Serene, isolated, and far from any distractions. The first night was calm. We unpacked, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. The lake, reflecting the full moon, seemed endless and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could almost feel the tension from the city melt away. It felt too quiet, though, unnervingly so. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the stillness of the woods at night. It was around midnight when I woke. I'd drifted off in one of the old wooden chairs by the window. Something stirred in my dream. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft tapping. I assumed it was rain, but the sky was clear. The sound came again. Light, but deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the window, listening, expecting to see raindrops. But there was nothing there. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for whatever could be making the noise. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Not a shadow, not a figure. It was a shape, indistinct, something that seemed out of place. I froze. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark outline of the woods outside. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops swaying in the wind. Whatever was there wasn't a part of the forest. It felt like it didn't belong. I got up slowly, every step creaking on the old wooden floor. The tapping continued, but now it wasn't just at the window. It was all around the house, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I peered out again, my eyes straining into the night. There, in the distance, I saw it, just for a second. A figure. Not human. Not quite. It was tall, thin, and it moved strangely, almost like a distorted reflection of something. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the wall. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? But the fear was too real. Something wasn't right. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice wouldn't work. The air felt colder, like something had seeped into the house. Then I heard it. The voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like it was right next to me. Come outside. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was outside. The chill in my bones deepened. I felt like I was frozen, rooted to the floor. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. The figure I had seen before was now closer, just beyond the porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. The whisper came again, sharper this time. Let me in. I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure took a step closer. It was unnatural. Wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, and its limbs moved like they weren't quite attached to its body. Panic surged through me. I forced myself to turn and sprint toward my friends' rooms. The taps on the window started again, louder, as if they were chasing me. I could feel something behind me, something that wanted to get in. I burst into their room, screaming, and dragged them from their beds. They were groggy at first, but the fear in my voice made them realize something wasn't right. We rushed out the back door, not daring to look back. The figure never followed us. We left the cabin behind, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods where we could no longer see the house. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in a diner miles from where we started, that I finally spoke. "I think we were followed," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something was waiting for us. None of us wanted to go back. None of us ever did." It was supposed to be a quiet evening walk through the old park, something I'd done countless times, but that night was different. Something about the air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. The sun had just set, casting the park in an eerie twilight, and as I strolled along the worn path, I noticed the usual sounds of the city had disappeared. No distant traffic hum, no birdsong, just silence. I wasn't far from the entrance when I realized something wasn't right. The atmosphere had changed entirely. The usual chirps of insects muted to nothing. It felt as though the world had stopped. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the cracked pavement, and I turned to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just empty darkness. I picked up my pace, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Shadows stretched long and thin across the path ahead, stretching beyond what was normal, and they seemed to shift unnaturally as though they were alive. My breath quickened, and I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that nothing could possibly be out there. As I reached a bend in the path, I stopped. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too distorted. The face, it wasn't a face, just a void, empty and black. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow sockets that seemed to absorb all the light around them. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen in place as it turned toward me, its movements jerky, like something inhuman trying to mimic the way a person walks. A soft, raspy noise escaped its hollow mouth, a sound that wasn't speech, but something far worse. Terror gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to move. The thing began to advance, each step sending chills down my spine. I could feel its gaze boring into me, but when I tried to look at its face, there was nothing. Just darkness, endless and oppressive. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. The silence stretched, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and began to walk away, its elongated form retreating into the shadows. The sound of its footsteps faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before I found the courage to move. I stumbled back toward the park entrance, never daring to look behind me again. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to find out. To this day, I still walk past that park, but I've never stopped looking over my shoulder. I was in the middle of a road trip, driving through endless stretches of desert. The sun had set hours ago, and now it was just me and the empty highway. There wasn't a single car in sight, nothing but the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone. I had been driving for what felt like forever, searching for the next gas station or even a small town, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the horizon like a thin line against the sky. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and the only sound in the car was the steady hum of the engine. I was starting to feel uneasy. Everything about this trip had felt off since the moment I left. The air was dry and still, not a whisper of wind or even the faintest rustle of leaves. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The low fuel light blinked on, warning me that I needed to find something soon. My eyes searched the horizon, hoping for a sign of life, a flicker of light, anything. But the desert was vast and empty, stretching out in all directions. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally saw something. In the distance, a faint glow of light, maybe a gas station or a motel. I couldn't tell which from this far away. But hope surged through me, and I pushed my foot down harder on the gas pedal. As I got closer, the light became clearer. It wasn't a gas station or a motel. It was a building, old and crumbling, its walls covered in cracked paint. A small, flickering sign hung above the entrance, barely legible in the fading light. It read, "The Oasis." My stomach twisted. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But at this point, I didn't care. I needed fuel, water, something, anything to keep going. I parked my car in front of the building and stepped out, the heat still radiating off the pavement. The air smelled dry and dusty, the kind of scent that clings to your throat. The front door creaked open as I pushed it. Inside, it was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs dangling from the ceiling. The shelves were empty, covered in a thick layer of dust. The coolers were all shut, ice long melted. It felt more like a ghost town than a place meant to serve travelers. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the silence. No reply. I moved through the aisles, hoping to find a supply of water or something to drink. But there was nothing. The only sound was my footsteps echoing against the cracked tile floor. It was eerie. The silence felt oppressive, as if the desert had swallowed up everything, leaving only this empty space behind. I made my way to the back of the store, where an old counter sat, covered in cobwebs. A small radio sat there, its antenna bent, dust coating its surface. I picked it up, hoping maybe I could get some signal, but static hissed from the speaker. Nothing but dead air. Desperation started to set in. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. I had no idea how far I was from anything. I was isolated, completely alone in this vast, empty desert. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed from the direction of the front door. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, soft, deliberate, steady. It wasn't the wind. It didn't sound like something natural. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I crept toward the front, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from outside, but somewhere inside the building. I couldn't tell where exactly. It sounded like it was right in front of me, but there was nothing there. I turned to look back at the counter, and that's when I saw it. A dark shape standing behind the glass. It wasn't human. It had no distinct features, just a shadowy, distorted form. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I didn't know how that was possible. My breath hitched as I stepped back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It moved closer, slow, deliberate. I could hear its footsteps, even though they shouldn't have made a sound on the dust-covered floor. I bolted for the door, fear clouding my vision. The creaking footsteps followed me, closer now, as though it was right behind me. I threw open the door and sprinted into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was miles down the road, the building a distant blur behind me. My car waited, humming quietly, the only sound I could hear. I never went back. I don't know what I saw that night or if it was even real, but sometimes, when I drive through the desert, I wonder if I'll see that building again, or if something else will come for me. It was a quiet summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive. We didn't have any particular destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and soak in the stillness of the countryside. We left town with no real plan, winding down narrow back roads, passing the occasional farmhouse and letting the radio fill the silence. We ended up on an old, forgotten road, the kind with broken pavement and weeds pushing through cracks. It stretched on for miles, empty except for the occasional crows circling above. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the land in a dull orange glow. We pulled over at a random spot where the trees opened up, leaving a stretch of land that felt completely isolated. The silence was heavier now, the kind that creeps into your chest, making it harder to breathe. We got out of the car, stretched, and walked a few feet to sit on the hood, staring out at the horizon. It felt perfect, peaceful, distant, far from the chaos of everything. But as the minutes stretched on, a strange sense of tension began to creep in. My friend Jess was the first to break the silence. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all fell quiet, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the soft rustle of wind through the grass, but then, faintly, we heard it, a distant, echoing sound. A voice, perhaps, or something that barely resembled one. It was hard to tell. The sound came and went, almost like breathing, but slower, heavier. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to brush it off. Maybe it was just the wind, or some far-off noise we couldn't identify. But it didn't sit right. There was something too deliberate about it, like it was aware of us. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. We relaxed a bit, laughed nervously, and chalked it up to our imagination. But as soon as we settled back into our thoughts, we heard it again. This time, it was closer, more distinct. A whisper, drawn out, almost as if someone, or something, was speaking, but we couldn't make out the words. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. We all leaned in, listening harder now. The sound was coming from the trees, just beyond the clearing, just beyond where we could see. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on us. "Let's get back to the car," I said, standing up. My voice was shaky. The fear I felt wasn't like any I'd ever experienced. It was primal, instinctual. But as we turned to walk back, we heard it again. Closer this time, and clearer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was laughter. A low, hollow laughter, chilling in its emptiness. It didn't sound like any human laugh. It wasn't playful. It was wrong. We didn't speak. We didn't dare. Our feet moved faster, scrambling back toward the car, the laughter following us, echoing through the trees. When we reached the vehicle, we slammed the doors shut and locked them. I could barely see through the windshield, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The laughter didn't stop. It was all around us now, growing louder, closer. "I think we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Just as I was about to start the engine, Jess screamed. I turned to see what she was pointing at, and there, standing in the fading light, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its eyes empty and hollow, watching us from the edge of the woods. We didn't hesitate. The car roared to life, tires kicking up dust as we sped down the empty road. The figure remained behind, standing motionless as we drove away. But I could still hear the laughter, trailing off into the distance. Even now, I wonder what was out there that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just some animal, something we couldn't understand. But the look in its eyes, empty and hollow, tells me otherwise. Whatever was there, whatever followed us, is still out there. I never really believed in curses or legends, at least not until that night. It was just an ordinary trip, something I had done 100 times before, driving late along the old highway that cuts through the dense forest. No one lives out there, just the trees and the empty stretch of road, fading into nothingness. That night, I was returning home from a late-night visit to a small town a few hours away. The drive itself was always uneventful, the kind of road that stretches endlessly with only the soft hum of the tires and the headlights cutting through the darkness. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. In the distance, there was a flicker of light in the forest. It wasn't coming from any vehicle. There were no other cars on the road for miles. The light flickered again, and this time I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a person exactly, but something shaped like one. Tall and thin, with limbs that stretched unnaturally, bending as it moved. Its face was barely visible, but I could make out hollow, dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness directly at me. Panic surged through my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move like a human, more like something inhuman, unnatural. It stayed there, watching me, unmoving, as if waiting. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and sped up, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees whipped past me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping pace with me, just beyond my vision, its presence looming closer with every passing second. When I glanced back in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of road and the trees rushing past. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. Eventually, the forest thinned and the road straightened. I glanced at the clock, nearly 3 a.m. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel tighter. The figure had vanished, but something in the air still felt heavy. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, my mind consumed by the image of those dark, hollow eyes. When I finally reached my driveway and stepped out of my car, the woods beyond seemed quieter than ever, as if they had been holding their breath the entire night. I still don't know what I saw, and I try not to think about it. But sometimes, when the night is too quiet and the trees outside my window seem to stretch too far, I wonder if that figure is still out there, waiting. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, Quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness, but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait, as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes, staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. It was a calm evening when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the beach. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sand as we arrived. We parked near the shore, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. There were only a few scattered families and a couple of couples enjoying the evening, but the vast beach felt almost empty. The horizon stretched endlessly, the ocean in front of us glowing with the fading light of the day. We set up a small bonfire, sitting on the warm sand, the flames flickering and casting dancing shadows. The sound of the waves was soothing, and the cool breeze carried the smell of the sea. For a while, everything felt perfect. It was one of those simple moments you cherish. Good company, good weather, and nothing but the vast ocean around you. As the night deepened, we got lost in conversation, laughing and sharing stories. Time slipped away. At some point, I noticed the others had fallen into a comfortable silence, gazing out at the water. I turned to look at them, but something felt off. The ocean was unusually quiet. There was no typical hum of waves crashing against the shore, no seagulls squawking. It felt still, as though the entire beach had been frozen in time. I got up and walked to the edge of the water, the sand cooling beneath my feet. The horizon stretched endlessly, the darkening sky blending with the sea. But that silence, it gnawed at me, crawling under my skin. A faint glow emerged from the water, far out beyond the waves. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the moon, but the light wasn't reflecting off the surface. It was coming from beneath it. A pulse, rhythmic and slow, like a heartbeat. I called out to my friends, but no sound came from my mouth. I turned around to them, but they weren't there anymore. I was alone. Panic set in as I turned back to the ocean. The glow was closer now, stretching closer to the surface. I could see it more clearly, an unnatural, eerie light that seemed to come from something below. A figure emerged from the water, pale and translucent. Its face was obscured, its body skeletal, almost ghost-like. It didn't move like a living thing. It glided toward me with a slow, unsettling grace, the light from beneath its form illuminating the dark waters. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to look away. The creature came closer, and I could feel its presence invading my mind, as if it had seen straight through me. The air was thick, and the sound of the waves had vanished entirely. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The figure stopped, its shadow stretching toward me. But it didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel the weight of its gaze, its intent, silent and suffocating. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the water, vanishing without a trace. The ocean returned to its restless state, waves crashing against the shore once more. The sound returned, but it no longer felt familiar. The beach was empty again, and my friends had never been there. I stood there, heart racing, staring at the vast, dark ocean. Alone. Whatever had come from the water was gone, but I knew it hadn't left. It had taken something with it, something I couldn't explain, and I was left wondering if it would ever come back. It was a summer evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old abandoned amusement park just outside of town. The place had always been off limits, but rumors had circulated for years about how eerie it had become after being shut down. Overgrown with weeds, faded signage, and cracked pavement stretching as far as the eye could see, the park was a relic from a time long gone. We figured we'd go check it out, just for the thrill of it. The sun was setting as we made our way through the rusting entrance gates. Everything about the place felt surreal. The Ferris wheel, once a shining beacon of joy, stood now as a towering, skeletal structure swaying gently in the breeze. Most of the rides were broken or tilted at odd angles, their once bright colors dulled and faded by years of neglect. We wandered further into the park, snapping photos, laughing and making jokes about how haunted it probably was. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew, and the wind carried the creaking sounds of metal swaying. Even the smallest things, the chirping of insects, the soft rustling of leaves, felt amplified, as if the silence of the park had grown too loud. At some point, we decided to split up. It wasn't exactly planned, but we were curious to explore more, and with no cell service, it didn't matter much. The sun was nearly gone now, and the park was shrouded in deepening shadows. My group stayed near the old roller coaster, the tracks buckling in several places, making the whole structure look like it could collapse at any moment. That's when we heard it, the sound of distant laughter. It wasn't ours. It was coming from further inside the park, echoing through the hollow spaces between rides and buildings. I froze, the laughter sharp and unsettling, like it didn't belong here. "What the hell?" I whispered, glancing at my friends. They shrugged it off as more of the creepy ambiance, but something in the sound felt wrong. Like it wasn't the playful kind of laughter you expect in an amusement park. It was hollow, distorted, as if coming from something that shouldn't be alive. We stood there, unsure, but before we could move, we heard it again. Closer this time. Louder. The sound seemed to be circling the park, following us without ever appearing. The chill in the air grew stronger, and the excitement that had been buzzing earlier was replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Let's head back," someone said, their voice quivering. We all agreed, eager to leave, but as we began walking, the laughter came again. This time, it wasn't just one sound. It was multiple voices. They echoed all around us, overlapping, as if we were surrounded. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The path we had taken seemed longer than it should have, and with each step, the laughter grew louder and more distorted. Shadows danced in the fading light, shifting unnaturally in ways that no wind or movement could create. Then came the creaking of the Ferris wheel. It was slow at first, like something winding itself into motion, but we didn't hear the sounds of it turning, only the groans of metal under unseen pressure. Suddenly, it stopped. The laughter had ceased entirely. We turned around, breath catching in our throats. Standing beneath the giant wheel, framed in the dim light, was a figure, tall, pale, and eerily still. Its face was obscured by a tattered hood, but there was no mistaking the outline of its form. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us, waiting. We didn't stay long enough to figure out what it was. We ran, heart pounding, sprinting through the park as fast as we could, the echoes of our own footsteps and the distant laughter still ringing in our ears. We never looked back. It was the last day of my trip to the mountains. I had spent the past week hiking, exploring remote trails and basking in the beauty of nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least during the day. On my final evening, I decided to take one last walk down to a secluded pond deep in the forest. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The trees stretched high above, casting long shadows that made it feel like the world was shrinking around me. The walk to the pond wasn't long, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the isolation, the stillness pressing against my chest. It felt as though the world had been hushed just for me. I reached the pond, which glimmered under the dim light of the stars reflecting off the water. I sat down on a rock, letting out a long breath. As I stared into the still pond, something shifted in the water's surface. A ripple formed, spreading outward in slow waves. I leaned in closer, my reflection breaking apart with each wave. But then something else appeared. Something underneath the surface. At first, it looked like just another reflection, distorted by the ripples. But then I saw it. Two pale, lifeless eyes staring back at me from the depths. I stumbled back from the water, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched those eyes slowly rise from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its movements awkward, unnatural. It was pale, its skin wrinkled and damp like it had been submerged for years. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. The figure didn't step fully out of the water. It hovered just above the surface, those hollow eyes still locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me, but its gaze never wavered. I ran, heart racing, lungs burning with every step. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees stretching their branches toward the ground like clawed hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my campsite, my chest heaving. The echo of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I returned to the pond one last time, but there was nothing there, just the still water and the empty forest. Whatever I saw, whatever that thing was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere deep in the shadows of the woods. I used to visit my grandfather's house every summer when I was a kid. It was an old farmhouse, isolated, sitting at the edge of a quiet valley. My parents used to leave me there for weeks while they traveled, and I never minded. Grandpa was old and grumpy, but he told the best stories about the woods that surrounded us. The house itself wasn't much, a weathered wooden structure with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. Outside, there were fields of tall grass stretching endlessly, and beyond that, the forest. One evening, as I explored the woods near his house, I noticed something strange. There was an old, abandoned barn deeper into the trees, one I had never seen before. It stood isolated from the rest of the woods, its roof sagging and walls covered in ivy. It was out of place, and curiosity got the better of me. I approached the barn, my steps quiet on the grass. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, almost imperceptible noise, like whispers carried by the wind. I stopped, listening. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside the barn, but there was no sign of life around it. I pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the barn was dark, except for slivers of light filtering through the broken roof. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy. It smelled of decay, wood, rot, and something else I couldn't place. I could barely see, but I moved cautiously, my heartbeat quickening. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. A tall, slender shadow that didn't quite belong. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had grown louder, almost like they were surrounding me now. I strained to see more, but the figure remained in the shadows. Then, slowly, it moved. Not like a human, though. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if whatever this thing was didn't know how to walk properly. It tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its hollow eyes. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more frantic. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, the barn now filled with that oppressive silence, only broken by those relentless whispers. And then, from the shadows, I heard a voice. "Help me." It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human either, low and raspy, like it hadn't spoken in centuries. My legs felt like lead, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. The whispers became screams, but they were inside my head. I could feel them, clawing at my mind. The figure stepped closer, its limbs bent awkwardly as if they didn't belong to a living thing, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I collapsed to the floor, unable to move or think. My heart thundered in my chest, and the barn was silent again. I sat there for what felt like hours, unsure if the fear or the silence was worse. When I finally managed to stand, I left the barn and didn't look back. The rest of the summer passed without further incident. My grandfather never mentioned the barn, and I never brought it up. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I know one thing. It wasn't human, and it wasn't supposed to be there. It was a late summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old lighthouse on the edge of the coast. We had heard the stories about the place. The locals always mentioned strange things happening out there, but none of us believed in the so-called haunted lighthouse tales. We were just looking for an adventurous night, something to break the monotony of our usual weekends. The lighthouse stood on a narrow stretch of rocky coastline, rising above the crashing waves. The air was thick with salt, and the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly, the sun dipping into the dark sea. We parked the car a few hundred feet from the lighthouse and started walking the narrow gravel path that led up to it. The wind was fierce, tearing at our jackets, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below echoed like a low, persistent hum. It was eerie, but we all just laughed it off, attributing it to the remoteness of the place. When we reached the base of the lighthouse, the first thing I noticed was how worn down it looked. The old white paint was peeling, revealing patches of weathered stone beneath. It felt abandoned, yet oddly familiar. We climbed the spiral staircase inside, the sound of our footsteps clattering against the cold metal steps. At the top, the view was stunning. The sun had fully set by now, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple, the stars beginning to emerge. We stood there, leaning against the railing, mesmerized by the vastness of the ocean stretching out before us. But that's when I noticed something unusual. It wasn't just the beauty of the view, it was the silence. No seagulls, no distant boats, no wind. It was as though the world had stopped. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, breaking the quiet. They all turned, confused. "Hear what?" someone replied. "I don't know. It's too quiet. It's unnatural." As the minutes dragged on, we stood there staring out at the horizon. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing on the edge of the cliff. My breath hitched. "Is that someone out there?" I whispered, pointing. None of them saw it. The figure was silhouetted against the dark sea, motionless, as if waiting. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but it didn't move. And then, just as suddenly as I'd seen it, the figure was gone. I glanced at my friends, but they were still oblivious, staring out at the sea. "Maybe it's just my eyes playing tricks," I said, trying to brush it off. But my heart still pounded, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We made our way down from the lighthouse, the night feeling heavier than before. The walk back to the car was silent. None of us spoke much, the weight of whatever we had seen still lingering in the air. It wasn't until we got back to town and were sitting in the diner, hours later, that things took an even stranger turn. One of my friends, Mark, suddenly leaned forward, his face pale. "Did anyone else feel like we weren't the only ones up there?" His voice was low, almost trembling. We all looked at him, nodding slowly. Every single one of us had the same feeling. That figure we'd seen wasn't something imagined. That figure. What if it wasn't human? I asked quietly, the unease washing over me again. The room grew silent. That's when it hit me. The stories we had dismissed earlier about the lighthouse being haunted came rushing back. What if they were true? What if whatever that figure was had been watching us all night? We never went back to that lighthouse, and even now, I wonder if something still watches from the cliffs at night, waiting for the next visitors to stumble upon its lonely, desolate shores. It was supposed to be just an ordinary day at home. The house sat on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by open fields and woods that stretched for miles in every direction. I lived alone, but I wasn't one to feel uneasy about the quiet, isolated life. At least, I wasn't until that day. The morning started off normal, just another day of cleaning, catching up on emails, and preparing for the usual chores. But something about the air felt off. It wasn't heavy or oppressive, just different. I shook it off, attributing it to the weather. Maybe the storm they'd predicted was finally rolling in. Around noon, the rain began, soft at first, but growing stronger by the hour. I watched it from the kitchen window, sipping my coffee. The sky was a thick, dull gray, and everything beyond the yard blurred under the falling sheets. I didn't think much of it until I heard the knock. It came softly at first, 3 quick raps on the front door. I froze, my coffee halfway to my lips. The knocking came again, a bit louder this time, persistent. But no one ever showed themselves. I told myself it was probably just someone needing shelter from the storm. Maybe a neighbor, though no one I recognized. I stood in front of the door, heart hammering, and cracked it open just a little. No one was there. I peered outside into the rain, but the porch was empty. There was no one around, just the relentless downpour and the empty, soaking fields beyond. I checked the locks and decided to ignore it. Must have been my imagination, I told myself. Storms can mess with your head. I went back to the living room, the chill of the rain beginning to seep into my bones. The windows fogged up as the rain continued to fall harder. The noise outside grew louder, the steady pitter-patter of droplets becoming a relentless pounding. It was soothing in a way, like the world was washing away everything around me. Hours passed. I lost track of time, engrossed in some half-read book, when a sudden noise made my blood run cold. A slow, scraping sound came from the back of the house, faint but deliberate, like something dragging across the floor. My stomach clenched and I sat there, frozen, waiting. The scraping grew louder. It wasn't coming from the window or the door, but from deeper inside the house. The kind of sound that made you wonder how something could even move like that. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, maybe some loose shutter flapping against the wall, but the wind doesn't scrape like that. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. Each step felt heavier, each breath quieter. The scraping continued, rhythmic, unnerving. I reached the hallway leading to the back of the house and shined my light down the dark corridor. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched over and shuffling, moving towards the kitchen. Its back was grotesquely twisted and its arms were far too long, dragging along the floor. I couldn't make out a face, just dark voids where eyes should have been and something glistening at the corners of its mouth. Panic surged through me, but I didn't scream. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, frozen in place as the thing advanced. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy breathing that seemed to echo through the house. Then it stopped. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, I could feel its presence just a few feet away, as if it had paused, waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing through the quiet. Who's there? I managed to whisper, but my voice barely escaped. Silence. Another long minute passed, the air thick with dread. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breathing and the relentless rain outside. Slowly, cautiously, I backed away, retracing my steps. The figure never followed. I didn't hear it leave. But when I checked the back door, the lock was undone. I didn't sleep that night, clutching my phone tightly, waiting for dawn. The storm raged on, but whatever had been there, watching, had never come back. I've always been a creature of habit. Every Friday night, I'd grab my camera and head to the old train tracks that cut through the woods. It wasn't a destination anyone talked about. It was just a place, quiet and desolate, where I could sit and lose myself in the sounds of the passing trains. That night was no different. I parked my car at the edge of the tracks and made my way through the dense underbrush. The woods stretched on forever, the trees towering above, blocking out any sign of the outside world. I loved the solitude, the way everything seemed to pause out here. No phone signal, no noise, no interruptions, just me and the sound of the tracks stretching into the distance. I set my tripod up, adjusting the camera to capture the faint glow of the distant train lights. As I waited, I realized how dark it had become. The forest had swallowed all light, leaving only the cold glow of the moon casting shadows over the tracks. A slight breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant hum of a train echoed faintly in the distance. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a shape, slender and dark, blending into the shadows. I thought maybe it was an animal, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. Smooth, almost fluid, yet completely wrong. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it wasn't natural. The figure stepped closer, moving with that same eerie grace, never making a sound. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera. My heart pounded, every nerve on edge. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. As it drew nearer, I could make out more details. It wasn't fully human. The proportions were off. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that no person could. But the most disturbing thing was its face. No eyes, no nose, just a blank, hollow void where a face should have been. I wanted to look away, to grab my camera and run, but something held me there, frozen in place. The figure stood just a few feet from me now, its inky, featureless face staring straight ahead. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. That's when I realized it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me. Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. It tilted its head as if examining me. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. The silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of a train far off in the distance. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling as I reached for my camera. The lens trembled as I brought it up, but there was nothing to capture. No figure, no tracks, just the woods. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to process what I had seen. The train came, its light sweeping through the trees, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I waited, and when it passed, I grabbed my tripod and camera, my mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I never went back. I'll never forget that night. It started like any other. My friends and I decided to take a late-night trip to the old observatory on the outskirts of town. It wasn't something we normally did, but curiosity got the better of us. The observatory was an eerie place, abandoned for years, surrounded by forests that seemed to go on forever. When we arrived, everything felt different from the start. The building had a sense of stillness that wasn't natural. It wasn't like the quiet of the woods, it was more oppressive, more unnatural. The air felt heavy, as if something was watching, waiting. We approached the gate that led to the entrance, its iron bars creaking as we pushed through. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in on one side. The place looked ancient, like it had been forgotten for decades. We ventured inside, flashlights flickering as we made our way through the dust-covered rooms. The once magnificent observatory was now a hollow shell, debris strewn across the floor and old telescopes covered in cobwebs. The silence felt deafening, the kind that makes your skin crawl, like the forest had swallowed everything whole. As we made our way deeper, I noticed something strange. There was no sound at all, not even from the forest beyond. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, nothing. It was as if the whole world had stopped. We found our way to the control room, the only part of the building that still had some semblance of structure. The faded, old star maps hung from the walls, their bright colors now faded and cracked. It was eerie, standing in a place that was once alive with science, now abandoned and lifeless. That's when we noticed something wasn't right. The flicker of our flashlights cast distorted shadows on the walls. It felt like the shadows were shifting, moving in ways they shouldn't. I turned to ask my friend what he thought, but when I spoke, my voice barely came out. It was as if the very air had swallowed it. Something felt off. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I scanned the room. And that's when I saw it. Just for a fleeting moment, a figure in the corner. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching, waiting. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but when I looked again, it was gone. We kept exploring, trying to shake the feeling of unease. My friend checked the broken telescope, pointing the lens toward the sky. "It's jammed," he said, fumbling with the controls. Then he gasped. The sky through the lens wasn't what it should have been. The stars, usually so distant and infinite, were distorted, twisted, flickering as if they weren't really there. A strange hum began to fill the room, subtle at first, but growing louder. "What's happening?" my friend whispered. I didn't know what to say. The hum grew into a low, almost mechanical vibration, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on us harder. It was like the world was bending, as though we were seeing something we weren't supposed to. That's when I noticed it again. That figure, tall, pale, and unnervingly still, was back, standing just at the edge of the room. This time, its face was visible. It wasn't human. Its eyes weren't empty but filled with something ancient, something malevolent. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, as if it had always been there. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel my ears popping, the vibrations reverberating through my chest. I turned to my friends, but they were gone, vanished without a trace. I was alone. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure was closer now, standing right in front of me, its eyes boring into mine. And then, just as quickly as everything had started, the hum stopped. The world went silent again. I blinked, shaking, and found myself back in the control room. My friends were there, looking at me, their faces pale. They were talking, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't hear a word. It was as if the silence had returned with a vengeance. We left the observatory in silence, no one speaking of what we had seen. I glanced back at the building one last time, the distant trees now swaying, as if something unseen was moving just beyond the edge of the woods. I'll never forget those hollow eyes, the hum, and the silence. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. It started on a quiet summer evening. I was driving down the winding country road, away from the lights of the city and toward the small, rural town I called home. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a deep, orange glow behind the trees. I wasn't in a rush. The journey was peaceful, nothing but open fields stretching out on either side of the road. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, just a text from a friend reminding me to take the back route. "The usual traffic's a nightmare," they'd said. I smiled and checked the screen. Sure enough, there were no cars ahead, no one behind me. The road was empty. As I drove deeper into the countryside, I felt the weight of the quiet settle around me. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of distant crickets. I took a deep breath, letting the calmness wash over me. It was so different from the chaos of the city. It was peaceful. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just someone waiting for a ride, but as I got closer, I realized how still they were. The figure didn't move. No wave, no glance, just standing there, perfectly still, like a mannequin. I passed them without slowing down, my pulse quickening. I told myself they were probably just lost, maybe hitchhiking. But the image of that unmoving figure stuck with me. A few miles further, I came across another one, and this time closer to the edge of a small, overgrown field. The figure stood just a few feet from the road, completely still, staring off into the distance. I passed by, this time slower, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. There were more. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, I had counted 5. All of them standing still at the side of the road, staring into the darkness, unmoving. I was just about to dismiss the whole thing when a shiver ran down my spine. What if they weren't people? What if they weren't even real? I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. Not just standing there waiting, but following. It wasn't until I was almost home that I realized something else. They hadn't moved. I made it back safe, but the silence of that night, the sight of those figures, still haunts me. I still drive that road sometimes, hoping to find some explanation, but I never do. It was a quiet, ordinary Friday night. I worked at a small local museum, one of those places with dim lighting and long hallways filled with ancient artifacts. The building had a certain charm to it, but by night it felt hollow, lifeless, like the stories of the past were fading into silence. My shift was from midnight to 8 a.m., and most nights were uneventful, just me and the quiet hum of security cameras. That night, everything was routine as usual. I walked through the galleries, checking the displays, making sure everything was locked up tight. The only sounds were the creak of my footsteps and the faint echo of the security system beeping softly. Around 2 a.m., I was in the main hall near the old exhibit on ancient civilizations. The air felt heavy, like it had been pulled from somewhere deep beneath the earth. The lights flickered once, briefly, and then returned to their usual dull glow. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the building settling. I glanced at the case with the ancient pottery, its intricate designs worn from years of dust and time. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the display cases was cracked open, my stomach twisted. These cases were made to be impossible to open without the alarm system triggering. The glass wasn't shattered, it was simply opened, carefully. I approached, my breath quickening. The artifact inside, the ancient stone mask, was gone. In its place was nothing but empty air. I called security immediately, my voice shaky. The line crackled, but no one answered. I wandered through the museum, heart pounding as I checked each exhibit. One by one, I realized others had been tampered with. A display of ancient scrolls was wide open, the texts scattered on the floor. A case housing old coins was now empty. The more I walked, the more I noticed. Every artifact was either disturbed or missing. Panic set in. What was happening? Someone had broken in, but there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of where they'd gone. I turned a corner and froze. The security camera feed on the wall was glitching, the screen flickering wildly. I stared at the screen, my breath catching. The camera wasn't showing the empty hallways it should have been. Instead, I could see something else. In the grainy, distorted feed, I saw figures, tall, shadowy figures walking through the museum. They moved silently like they were gliding rather than walking. Their faces were obscured, but I knew instinctively they were not human. One of them stopped in front of the empty display case where the ancient mask had been. The figure tilted its head as if inspecting the empty space. Then it turned slowly, as though it could feel my gaze, and began walking toward the camera. The screen went black. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. There was no one to call, no one who could help me. I could feel them in the museum, moving through the darkened halls like ghosts. As I stood frozen, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed, I noticed something else. The air was colder now, colder than it had any right to be, considering the time of year. The faint sound of whispers filled the stillness, voices murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. I wanted to run, but every instinct told me that running wouldn't help. They were already here. I kept walking, trying to find an escape, but everywhere I went, the shadows followed. I realized, too late, that the missing artifacts weren't random. They were gone. Stolen by the figures that had emerged from some forgotten part of the museum. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't from the shadows or from the air. It was behind me, right beside me. Return what was taken. I turned around, but there was nothing there. No one. No sound, except for the whispers, still echoing from the darkness. I didn't know if I was losing my mind, but I knew I couldn't stay. I rushed out of the museum, sprinting into the night, my breath visible in the cold air. The police came later, of course. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone breaking in. The artifacts were never recovered, and the museum remained silent. They assumed someone had broken in and escaped, but I knew the truth. Whatever those things were, whatever had taken the artifacts, they were still there, waiting. I've never gone back to that museum, and I never will. I still can't forget that night in the abandoned subway station. It was supposed to be a routine trip home after a long day, but everything felt off from the moment I stepped onto the platform. I had just missed the last train, so I found myself alone in the dim light of the old station. The air was thick with dust, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive. There wasn't a soul in sight, and even the usual sounds of distant trains were absent. The station had a strange, heavy atmosphere, as though the city itself had forgotten about it. I sat down on the platform bench, my phone dimming as I glanced at it. No signal. I sighed, slipping it back into my pocket. That's when I noticed the flickering lights. The fluorescent bulbs hummed and flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced across the tiles. The whole place felt like it was slipping into another dimension. Time passed, or at least it felt like it did. The stillness stretched on and the silence grew deeper. Then I heard something, a soft, dragging noise echoing from somewhere deeper into the station. It was slow, uneven, like someone was shuffling along the tiles. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, closer. I should have left, but something kept me there, my fear rooted in place. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw it, a figure. It was tall, gaunt, and moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its face was obscured by a shadow, but I could see the unsettling way it tilted its head as if listening. The closer it came, the more I realized its footsteps didn't match any human pattern. They were uneven, like someone dragging something heavy behind them. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked in place. I couldn't look away as the figure got closer. It wasn't until it was right in front of me that I saw it, a faint, hollow glow where its eyes should have been. The smell hit me first, something rotten and metallic. The silence broke into a low, distorted whisper, like the sound of something ancient and wrong. "Leave," it rasped, its voice sounding almost mechanical. "Not supposed to be here." In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed to run, but when I turned to flee, my legs buckled beneath me. The creature was gone, vanished like a memory. The subway station was still and empty once more, the lights flickering as though nothing had ever happened. I got up and made my way to the edge of the platform, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home. Even now, I wonder what I saw that night, and whether it's still waiting for someone else to stumble into the darkness. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone, dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl. but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human, but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadow stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more, the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail, and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking. thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still.